Number 1, Raymond Fernandez and Martha Beck, a lonely heart scam that turned deadly and became one of the most infamous killer couple cases in American history. Raymond Martinez Fernandez was born on December 17, 1914, in Hawaii to Spanish parents, and his early life gave few outward signs of the darkness that would later consume him. His family moved to Connecticut when he was young, and he grew up in a relatively ordinary household, though those who knew him later described him as manipulative, egotistical, and unerringly charismatic when he chose to be. As a young man, Fernandez struggled to find his place in the world, drifting through various jobs and failed relationships. He married a young woman and had 4 children, but he was a neglectful and emotionally absent father, more interested in pursuing his own pleasures than in building a stable family life. His life took a dark and fateful turn during World War II when he enlisted in the United States Army. While stationed overseas, Fernandez suffered a severe head injury in a workplace accident, a fracture to his skull that required a lengthy hospitalization. Medical professionals who later examined him would argue about the extent to which this injury altered his personality, but those closest to him noticed a marked change after he returned home. He became more erratic, more prone to anger, and disturbingly more obsessed with sex and manipulation. It was after the war that Fernandez discovered what would become his primary method of operation. He began responding to Lonely Hearts advertisements, personal ads placed by women seeking companionship or romance in newspapers and magazines. Fernandez had a knack for identifying vulnerable women, particularly widows and spinsters who had accumulated savings or property and who were desperate for the affection and attention that Fernandez could convincingly simulate. He would sweep into their lives with grand declarations of love, move in with them quickly, and then begin draining their finances through a combination of outright theft, coerced loans, and manipulated property transfers. When the money ran out or the women grew suspicious, Fernandez would simply vanish, moving on to his next target without a backward glance. This scheme worked well for him for several years, allowing him to travel the country living off the assets of women he left emotionally and financially devastated. Then, in 1947, Raymond Fernandez placed his own Lonely Hearts advertisement, and a woman named Martha Beck responded. Martha Seabrook Beck was born in 1920 in Milton, Florida, and her early life was marked by profound loneliness and a desperate need for acceptance. She was a heavy-set woman who had been cruelly teased and ostracized throughout her childhood, and she grew up feeling unattractive and unwanted. As an adult, Martha, desperate for companionship, married young, but the marriage was deeply unhappy and ended in divorce. She had 2 children from the marriage and struggled to support them while battling severe depression and a fragile sense of self-worth. Martha found work as a nurse in a hospital, a profession that gave her some degree of stability but did nothing to satisfy her aching need for love and belonging. When she saw Raymond Fernandez's advertisement, something in his words spoke directly to the deepest wounds she carried. Their correspondence was passionate and intense, and when they finally met in person, Martha was utterly captivated. Fernandez, for his part, recognized in Martha a useful tool. She was devoted to him with a ferocity that bordered on fanaticism, and she was willing to do whatever he asked. What began as Fernandez exploiting Martha's vulnerability quickly evolved into something far more sinister and symbiotic. Martha discovered what Fernandez was doing, that he was seducing women for their money, and rather than being repulsed, she embraced it. She inserted herself into his scheme, posing as his sister or his business partner, a ruse that made Fernandez seem more respectable and less threatening to the women he targeted. Martha's role evolved from enabler to active participant, and eventually, she became the driving force behind some of the most horrific acts the couple would commit. Their first known murder occurred in December 1947. Fernandez had been corresponding with a 66-year-old widow named Janet Fay, who lived in Albany, New York. Fay was a quiet, religious woman who had inherited her late husband's business and had a modest but respectable amount of savings. Fernandez traveled to Albany and charmed Fay, convincing her that he was a wealthy businessman interested in marriage. Martha arrived shortly afterward, introducing herself as Fernandez's sister and moving into Fay's home. Within days, the tension in the household escalated. Fay began to grow suspicious of Fernandez's intentions, and Martha, consumed by jealous rage at any woman who received Fernandez's attention, whether genuine or performative, became openly hostile. On the night of December 28, 1947, the situation exploded. Martha confronted Faye in her bedroom, and a violent struggle ensued. Martha beat Faye severely, striking her repeatedly with a hammer, and then Fernandez stepped in and strangled the elderly woman to death. They stuffed her body into a trunk, poured perfume over it to mask the odor of death, and fled. The couple's second known victim was a young woman named Esther Hennick, a 28-year-old mother who lived in Bay City, Michigan, with her husband and 2 young children. Fernandez had begun a relationship with Hennick through the Lonely Hearts Network, and when he arrived in Bay City, he moved into her home while her husband was away working. Martha followed, again posing as the sister. When Hennick's husband returned unexpectedly and grew suspicious of the arrangement, Fernandez and Martha realized their scheme was in danger of being exposed. On February 11, 1949, they murdered Esther Hennick, though the exact method of her killing was never definitively established because her body was not discovered for months. They buried her in the basement of the home, and when the body was eventually found, the evidence pointed clearly to the couple. It was the murder of Delphine Downing, however, that finally brought their reign of terror to an end. Delphine Downing was a young widow living in Wyoming, Michigan, with her 2-year-old daughter, Raynell. Fernandez targeted Downing in the summer of 1949, moving into her home and beginning the familiar process of gaining access to her finances. Martha arrived and immediately clashed with Downing, who was increasingly frightened by the situation. On one occasion, Fernandez shot Downing in the head, wounding but not immediately killing her. Rather than seek medical help, Fernandez and Martha kept the wounded woman in the house for several days while they figured out what to do next. Martha, in a chilling act of depravity, then gave Downing's toddler daughter large doses of sleeping pills to keep the child quiet. Eventually, realizing that Downing was still alive and might be able to identify them, Martha suffocated the injured woman with a pillow. Fernandez then drowned the 2-year-old girl, Raynell, in a basin of water. They packed the bodies and fled to Grand Rapids, but their recklessness had finally caught up with them. Neighbors had noted the strange comings and goings at Downing's home, and police quickly identified Fernandez and Beck as suspects. They were arrested in Grand Rapids on August 31, 1949. The trial of Raymond Fernandez and Martha Beck became a media sensation, one of the first truly national true crime stories in the post-war American era. The press dubbed them the Lonely Hearts Killers, and the details of their crimes horrified the public in ways that few cases had before. The prosecution painted a devastating picture of a predatory pair who had systematically hunted vulnerable women, drained them of their resources, and then eliminated them when they were no longer useful or became obstacles. Fernandez and Beck turned on each other during the trial, each attempting to shift the bulk of the blame onto the other. Fernandez claimed that Martha was the dominant force behind the murders, that her jealous rages pushed him to violence against his will. Martha, in turn, painted Fernandez as a master manipulator who had completely taken over her mind and will, reducing her to a puppet who acted only out of blind devotion and fear. The jury in Michigan was unconvinced by either defense. On February 8, 1951, both Raymond Fernandez and Martha Beck were found guilty of first-degree murder for the killing of Delphine Downing and her daughter. The judge sentenced both of them to death by electrocution. They were transferred to Sing Sing Prison in New York to await execution. On March 8, 1951, Raymond Fernandez and Martha Beck were put to death in the electric chair at Sing Sing, going to their deaths within minutes of each other. Martha Beck went first, and according to witnesses, she walked to the chair with a strange calmness, though her final statements revealed a woman still in deep denial about the magnitude of what she had done. Fernandez followed, maintaining to the end that Martha had been the primary architect of the killings. The case of the Lonely Hearts Killers left a profound mark on American society. It exposed the dark underbelly of the personal advertisement culture that had flourished in the post-war years, revealing how easily predators could exploit the loneliness and isolation that many Americans, particularly women, experienced in an era before modern social connections. Newspapers and magazines ran extensive series on the case, and it became the subject of books, academic studies, and later, films. Psychologists and criminologists analyze the Fernandez-Beck dynamic as a textbook example of a folie à deux, a shared psychosis in which two individuals reinforce each other's pathological beliefs and behaviors until the combined result is far more dangerous than either person would have been alone. The case also prompted law enforcement agencies to take a closer look at the potential for fraud and violence connected to personal advertisements, leading to early forms of the kind of cautionary awareness that would later become commonplace with the advent of online dating. For the families of Janet Fay, Esther Hennick, Delphine Downing, and little Raynell Downing, the executions brought a measure of closure but could never undo the incomprehensible loss they had suffered. The community of Wyoming, Michigan, where the Downing murders took place, was particularly shaken, as the idea that a young mother and her toddler could be slaughtered in their own home by people they had trusted shattered any remaining illusion that small-town America was immune from the kind of predatory evil that most people associated with distant cities or fictional horror stories. The legacy of Raymond Fernandez and Martha Beck endures as a cautionary tale about the dangerous intersection of loneliness, manipulation, and unchecked pathological devotion, a reminder that the most terrifying monsters often wear the most convincing masks of love. Number 2, Gerald Arlen Gallego and Charlene Adele Gallego, a husband and wife who embarked on a horrifying multi-state kidnapping, rape, and murder spree that claimed the lives of at least 10 young women and girls across the American West during the late 1970s and early 1980s. Gerald Gallego was born on July 17, 1946, in Sacramento, California, into a family already stained with violence and criminality. His father, Gerald Arlen Gallego Sr., was a convicted murderer who had been executed in the gas chamber at San Quentin State Prison in 1955 for the murder of a sheriff's deputy in Mississippi. This grim paternal legacy cast a long shadow over Gerald Jr.'s life, though whether it was genetics, environment, or a combination of both that produced the monster he became remains a subject of debate among those who studied the case. Gerald grew up primarily in Sacramento, raised by his mother and various stepfathers, and he displayed antisocial and violent behavior from a remarkably young age. He was in and out of juvenile detention facilities throughout his adolescence, and by the time he reached adulthood, he had accumulated a lengthy criminal record that included convictions for robbery, assault, and statutory rape. He was a man of average build but imposing presence, known for his explosive temper, his ability to switch from charming to terrifying in an instant, and his insatiable and deviant sexual appetites. Gerald married multiple times before he met the woman who would become his accomplice in atrocity, and each of his previous wives would later describe marriages marked by severe domestic violence, sexual degradation, and psychological terror. Charlene Adele Williams was born on October 10, 1956, in Redding, California, and her background stood in stark contrast to Gerald's. She was raised in what appeared to be a stable, middle-class home, and by all outward accounts, her childhood was unremarkable. She was described as a quiet, somewhat shy young woman who did reasonably well in school and graduated from high school without incident. Charlene married young, as was common in her community at the time, and had 2 children from her first marriage. The marriage ended in divorce, and Charlene found herself a single mother in her early 20s, working at various low-paying jobs and struggling to find direction. When she met Gerald Gallego at a poker parlor in Sacramento in 1977, she was 31 years old and at a vulnerable point in her life, lonely and searching for something to fill the emptiness she felt. Gerald, with his rough charisma and the dangerous edge that some women find irresistibly attractive, swept Charlene off her feet with an intensity that she mistook for passion and love. They married within weeks of meeting, and Charlene moved Gerald into the apartment she shared with her 2 young children. Almost immediately, the relationship revealed its true nature. Gerald was violently abusive, both physically and sexually. He subjected Charlene to degradations that she would later testify left her feeling broken and powerless. But instead of leaving, Charlene became psychologically enmeshed with her abuser in a way that psychologists would later recognize as a severe form of trauma bonding and coercive control. Gerald convinced Charlene that she was worthless without him, that no one else would ever want her, and that her only purpose was to serve his needs, no matter how depraved those needs became. It was Gerald who first articulated the fantasy that would drive their killing spree. He told Charlene that he needed young virgins, girls who were pure and untouched, to satisfy his sexual desires. When Charlene expressed the obvious impossibility of finding willing participants for such a scheme, Gerald made it clear that he intended to take what he wanted by force, and that Charlene was going to help him. He framed it as a test of her love and loyalty, telling her that if she truly loved him, she would do whatever was necessary to make him happy. This twisted logic, combined with the psychological grip Gerald held over her, broke down whatever moral resistance Charlene might have had. Their spree began on September 11, 1978, when Gerald and Charlene drove to a shopping mall in Sacramento and spotted two teenage girls, Kippy Vaught, who was 16 years old, and Brenda Judd, who was 14. Charlene, serving as the lure, approached the girls and engaged them in friendly conversation, gaining their trust by presenting herself as a safe and sympathetic adult. She convinced the girls to come with her to the Gallego apartment, ostensibly to socialize and have fun. Once the girls were inside, Gerald emerged with a gun, and the nightmare began. Both girls were repeatedly sexually assaulted by Gerald over the course of hours, while Charlene watched and participated under Gerald's direction. When Gerald was finished with them, he drove the girls to a remote area near the Sierra Nevada foothills and shot them both to death. Their bodies were discovered days later in a shallow grave, but the investigation initially went nowhere, as the girls had no known connection to the Gallegos and the couple had taken care to avoid leaving witnesses. Emboldened by the success of this first attack, the Gallegos accelerated their predatory pattern. On June 24, 1979, they struck again, this time targeting a 22-year-old waitress named Rhonda Scheffler and a 21-year-old nursing student named Kelly Hudspeth, whom they kidnapped from a busy street near the University of Nevada, Reno campus. Charlene again served as the lure, approaching the young women with a fabricated story about needing help or offering them a ride. Once the women were in the vehicle, Gerald pulled a gun and drove them to a secluded area in the Nevada desert. Both women were sexually assaulted before Gerald shot them to death and left their bodies in a remote ravine. The discovery of their remains sparked a major investigation by the Washoe County Sheriff's Office, but again, the Gallegos slipped through the net, as there was no forensic technology at the time to connect them to the crime scene and no surviving witnesses who could identify them. The killing continued with a horrifying frequency that defied belief. On April 24, 1980, the Gallegos kidnapped two teenage girls, Virginia Machel, who was 16, and Mary Sowers, who was 15, from a sidewalk near the Las Vegas Strip. The girls were taken to a remote desert location, sexually assaulted, and murdered. Their bodies were found weeks later, decomposed and partially scavenged by wildlife, which severely complicated the forensic investigation. Less than a month later, on May 20, 1980, the couple kidnapped two more young women, 20-year-old Karen Chipman and 19-year-old Shirley Lowe, from a street in Modesto, California. They were driven to a rural area in San Joaquin County, where Gerald sexually assaulted them before shooting them. Their bodies were discovered in an irrigation ditch. What made the Gallego case particularly disturbing was the degree to which Charlene participated in the selection, luring, and control of the victims. Unlike many partner cases where one participant is clearly passive or coerced into silence, Charlene was an active agent in the initial stages of each abduction. She approached the victims, gained their trust, and delivered them into Gerald's hands. She was present during the assaults, and while she later claimed that she never participated directly in the sexual violence and that she was terrified of Gerald, testimony from survivors and her own statements to investigators revealed a more complex and troubling picture. There were instances where victims begged Charlene for help, and she refused, instead following Gerald's instructions to keep them quiet and compliant. On at least one occasion, she was present when Gerald murdered a victim and did nothing to intervene. The spree finally came to an end through a combination of Gerald's growing recklessness and the courage of two survivors. On November 1, 1980, the Gallegos drove to a video arcade in Rancho Cordova, California, and spotted two teenage girls, 11-year-old Mary Elizabeth Souders and her friend, who was 15. Charlene lured the girls to the Gallego vehicle by asking them for directions and then offering them a ride home. Once the girls were inside, Gerald produced a gun and drove them to a remote area in the Sierra Nevada foothills. The younger girl, Mary Elizabeth, was sexually assaulted by Gerald, who then shot her to death. The older girl was also assaulted, but in a moment of extraordinary fortune, Gerald decided to spare her life. He later told Charlene that she reminded him of his daughter. The surviving girl was left in the desert, traumatized but alive, and she was able to make her way to a nearby road where she flagged down help. Her detailed description of her attackers and the vehicle they used gave investigators their first real break in the case. Around the same time, another young woman named Craig Miller and his girlfriend, Mary Elizabeth, were kidnapped from a steakhouse in Sacramento, though this particular case resulted in Craig's murder and his girlfriend's survival. The mounting evidence from survivors, combined with witness descriptions of the Gallego vehicle and the growing pattern of disappearances across multiple states, finally allowed law enforcement to close in. Gerald and Charlene Gallego were arrested on November 17, 1980, in Salt Lake City, Utah, after a routine traffic stop revealed that they were driving a vehicle matching descriptions connected to the investigations in California and Nevada. Once in custody, the psychological dynamic between the two began to fracture. Charlene, facing the very real possibility of the death penalty, began to cooperate with investigators. She agreed to plead guilty to reduced charges in exchange for her testimony against Gerald, and she provided detailed accounts of the abduction and murder of at least 10 victims across 4 states. Her testimony was devastating, painting a picture of Gerald as a controlling, violent predator who had terrorized her into compliance. Gerald, for his part, maintained that Charlene had been a willing and eager participant who had enjoyed the violence as much as he had. The trials were complex, spanning multiple jurisdictions because the crimes had been committed across state lines. Gerald was tried first in California, where he was convicted of the murders of Kippy Vaught and Brenda Judd, and sentenced to death. He was then extradited to Nevada, where he was tried and convicted for the murders of Rhonda Scheffler and Kelly Hudspeth, receiving a second death sentence. Charlene pleaded guilty in Nevada to second-degree murder and kidnapping, and in exchange for her testimony against Gerald, she was sentenced to 16 years and 8 months in prison. She was also sentenced to a concurrent term in California. The disparity in their sentences generated significant controversy and public outrage. Many people, including the families of the victims, felt that Charlene's active participation in the luring and abduction of young women and girls, her presence during the assaults and murders, and her failure to ever attempt to escape or alert authorities during the 2-year spree warranted a far harsher punishment than 16 years. Prosecutors acknowledged the uncomfortable reality that without Charlene's testimony, securing convictions against Gerald in multiple jurisdictions would have been far more difficult, and they made the pragmatic but painful decision to offer her a deal. Charlene served her sentence and was released on parole in July 1997, having served approximately 17 years. She changed her name and attempted to disappear from public view, though her location periodically became a subject of media interest and public anger. Gerald Gallego remained on death row in Nevada, housed at Ely State Prison. Over the years, he exhausted his appeals while maintaining his innocence and continuing to blame Charlene for the murders. On October 18, 2002, Gerald Arlen Gallego died of natural causes at a hospital in Reno, Nevada, at the age of 56. He was never executed, dying of cancer before the state could carry out the death sentence imposed by the courts. The Gallego case sent shockwaves through communities across the American West and prompted significant changes in how law enforcement agencies coordinated investigations that crossed state lines. The case was one of the early drivers of the development of the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, known as VICAP, which was designed to help law enforcement agencies share information about serial crimes and identify patterns that might link cases in different jurisdictions. Before VICAP and similar systems, a killer like Gerald Gallego could operate across state lines with relative impunity because police departments in different states had no efficient mechanism for sharing information about similar crimes. The families of the victims were left to grapple with a grief that was compounded by the horrifying nature of how their loved ones died. Many of the victims' parents became vocal advocates for victims' rights and for improvements in the way law enforcement handled missing persons cases, particularly cases involving teenagers and young adults who were often initially dismissed by police as runaways rather than potential crime victims. The case also forced a difficult public conversation about the nature of female criminality and the concept of coercion in abusive relationships. Charlene Gallego's defense hinged on the argument that she was a battered woman who had been psychologically destroyed by Gerald's abuse and that her participation in the crimes was the result of a form of coercion so complete that she had lost the capacity for independent moral judgment. While some domestic violence advocates and mental health professionals acknowledged the reality of severe trauma bonding, others pointed out that Charlene had multiple opportunities to seek help, to flee, or to alert authorities, and that she had instead chosen, over a period of 2 years, to actively participate in the abduction and delivery of innocent young women to a man she knew would torture, rape, and kill them. The debate was never fully resolved, and the Gallego case remains one of the most studied and debated examples of female criminal complicity in the true crime literature. The memory of the at least 10 young women and girls whose lives were stolen by Gerald and Charlene Gallego is preserved in the hearts of their families and in the investigative archives that document one of the most brutal and far-reaching killing sprees in American criminal history. Number 3, Douglas Daniel Clark and Carol Mary Bundy, a pair whose gruesome killings along the Sunset Strip in 1980 shocked even the most seasoned Los Angeles homicide detectives and exposed the terrifying reality of predatory violence hidden beneath the glamour of Hollywood. Douglas Clark was born on March 16, 1948, in Los Angeles, California, and his early life was characterized by a degree of instability that belied the middle-class appearances his family attempted to maintain. His father was a retired United States Navy officer who had served with distinction, and the family moved frequently during Clark's childhood, living in various locations both within the United States and abroad due to his father's military assignments. This nomadic existence made it difficult for Clark to form lasting friendships or develop a stable sense of identity, and those who knew him as a child and adolescent described a boy who was quiet, withdrawn, and oddly detached from the social interactions that came naturally to his peers. As he entered adulthood, Clark exhibited a pattern of behavior that was increasingly troubling, though it never quite crossed the threshold into criminality in a way that would attract serious attention from law enforcement. He served briefly in the United States Army but was discharged without distinction, and he then drifted through a series of jobs that reflected both his intelligence and his fundamental inability to function within normal social structures. Clark was reportedly of above-average intelligence and could be articulate and even charming in short interactions, but he was completely lacking in empathy, a deficit that became more pronounced as he aged. He developed an intense and deviant sexual fascination with the act of killing, particularly the killing of women during sexual encounters, a fantasy that he apparently nurtured in private for years before it escalated into action. Clark worked at a series of jobs in the Los Angeles area, including a stint as a boiler operator at a hospital and later as a mechanic and auto parts clerk. He was known among his co-workers as an odd and somewhat creepy individual who made women uncomfortable with his staring and inappropriate comments, but he was never reported for any behavior that rose to the level of actionable harassment. He had been married and divorced twice, and both of his ex-wives would later describe marriages that were marked by Clark's increasingly bizarre sexual demands and his emotional coldness. By 1980, Douglas Clark was living in a small apartment in the San Fernando Valley and working as a mechanic, spending his free time cruising the streets of Hollywood and the Sunset Strip in his car, an activity that would soon evolve from a disturbing hobby into a deadly pursuit. Carol Mary Bundy was born on August 12, 1944, in Salem, Oregon, and her path to becoming Douglas Clark's accomplice was paved with a lifetime of psychological instability, failed relationships, and a desperate need for male validation that made her vulnerable to manipulation by a predator of Clark's caliber. Bundy's childhood was marked by significant family dysfunction, including a father who was reportedly emotionally abusive and a home environment that provided none of the security or nurturing that a child needs to develop healthy psychological foundations. As a young woman, Carol was attractive and outgoing, but beneath the surface, she was a cauldron of emotional turmoil. She married for the first time at a young age, a union that produced 2 sons but dissolved quickly due to her husband's alleged infidelity and the emotional volatility that defined Carol's approach to relationships. She married and divorced 2 more times, and each relationship followed a similar pattern of intense initial passion followed by escalating conflict, jealousy, and eventual collapse. Carol struggled with her weight and with deep-seated feelings of inadequacy, and she attempted to cope with these feelings through a series of unhealthy mechanisms, including alcohol abuse and an increasing dependence on the approval of the men in her life. By the time she reached her mid-30s, Carol Bundy had developed a reputation among those who knew her as a woman who was always involved with a man, always desperate to keep whichever man she was with, and willing to tolerate an extraordinary degree of mistreatment in order to avoid being alone. She had moved to the Los Angeles area and was working as a nurse's aide and occasional gas station attendant, struggling financially and emotionally. When she met Douglas Clark at a bar in the San Fernando Valley in early 1980, she was immediately drawn to him in a way that was both intense and irrational. Clark, who was several years younger than Carol, recognized her vulnerability almost instantly and moved to exploit it with the practiced skill of a predator. He presented himself as a strong, dominant male figure who could provide Carol with the structure and direction she craved, and he quickly established complete psychological control over her. Their relationship became sexually intense and increasingly bizarre, with Clark introducing Carol to his violent sexual fantasies about killing women during intercourse. Rather than being repulsed, Carol, whose own psychological boundaries had been eroded by years of dysfunction and abuse, embraced Clark's fantasies and began to incorporate them into their relationship. Clark told Carol that he wanted to actually kill a woman during sex, and he asked her to help him find a victim. Carol, desperate to please Clark and terrified of losing him, agreed. The killing began in June 1980. Douglas Clark picked up a prostitute named Cynthia Chandler and an unknown second woman on the Sunset Strip and drove them to a secluded area where he shot both women in the head. The bodies were discovered in the early morning hours of June 11, 1980, in an alley behind a recording studio on Sunset Boulevard. Both women had been shot at close range with a handgun, and there was evidence of sexual activity. The Los Angeles Police Department launched a homicide investigation, but at this point, there was little to connect the murders to any specific suspect. The Sunset Strip was a known area for prostitution and drug activity, and the killings of sex workers, while always taken seriously by homicide detectives, did not initially generate the kind of media frenzy that would later surround the case. Clark, emboldened by the fact that he had not been caught, struck again just 2 days later, on June 13. He picked up a known prostitute and drug user named Exie Wilson on the Sunset Strip and drove her to a location where he shot her in the head. This time, however, Clark did not simply flee the scene. In an act of depravity that shocked even veteran investigators, Clark decapitated Wilson's body and took her head with him. He brought the head back to the apartment he shared with Carol Bundy and displayed it to her, and according to Bundy's later testimony, Clark engaged in acts of sexual violation with the severed head. Carol, rather than being horrified to the point of calling the police or fleeing, helped Clark dispose of the head by wrapping it in a bag and throwing it into a dumpster at a nearby shopping center. The discovery of Wilson's headless body and the subsequent search for her missing head became a major media story, and the press began referring to the unknown killer as the Sunset Strip Slayer. The intensity of the police investigation increased dramatically, and the Sunset Strip sex worker community was thrown into a state of terror. Detectives worked around the clock following leads and interviewing potential witnesses, but the killer had left behind remarkably little physical evidence. Clark continued to hunt. On June 24, he picked up a prostitute named Karen Jones on Sunset Boulevard and shot her in the head. Jones survived the shooting, though she was left with severe and permanent injuries. And she was able to provide investigators with a description of her attacker and his vehicle. Her survival was a critical turning point in the investigation, as it provided the first direct link between the murders and a specific individual. While Douglas Clark was responsible for the shooting murders of the women on the Sunset Strip, Carol Bundy was not merely a passive observer during the killing spree. On June 9, 1980, 2 days before the bodies of Cynthia Chandler and the unidentified woman were found, Carol Bundy committed a murder of her own that was separate from but related to Clark's activities. Bundy had become obsessed with a man named John Murray, a co-worker at the gas station where she sometimes worked. Murray was reportedly a quiet, religious man who had rejected Bundy's romantic advances, and Bundy's feelings of rejection metastasized into a rage that she channeled into violence. On the evening of June 9, Bundy lured Murray to her van, ostensibly to give him a ride home. Once inside the vehicle, Bundy produced a knife and stabbed Murray repeatedly, slashing his throat and nearly decapitating him. She then dumped his body near the Ventura Freeway. Bundy later told investigators that she killed Murray because he had gotten too close to discovering what she and Clark were doing, though this claim was viewed with skepticism by prosecutors, who believed that the murder was motivated primarily by Bundy's sexual jealousy and rage at being rejected. Bundy also reportedly told a coworker about the murder shortly after it happened, a confession that would later prove crucial to the case against her. The investigation into the Sunset Strip killings took a decisive turn when Carol Bundy, in a moment of apparent psychological unraveling, began talking about the murders to people around her. She told a coworker at the gas station that Clark had been killing women on the Sunset Strip and that she had helped him dispose of a head. The coworker, initially unsure whether to believe Bundy's claims, eventually contacted the police. Detectives immediately recognized the significance of this information, as the detail about the severed head was something that only someone with direct knowledge of the X.E. Wilson murder could have known. Police placed Bundy under surveillance and began building a case against both her and Clark. When investigators searched Clark's vehicle, they found forensic evidence linking him to the crime scenes, including bloodstains and firearms. Both Clark and Bundy were arrested in August 1980. Douglas Clark was charged with 6 counts of murder, and Carol Bundy was charged with 2 counts of murder, one for John Murray and one as an accessory in the deaths attributed to Clark. The trials of Douglas Clark and Carol Bundy were separated, and each presented unique challenges for prosecutors. Clark's trial began in 1983, and his defense attorney mounted an aggressive strategy aimed at discrediting the forensic evidence and portraying Clark as a victim of Carol Bundy's manipulation. Clark himself took the stand in his own defense, an unusual and risky move for a defendant facing multiple murder charges, and he presented himself as a calm, rational man who had been framed by a mentally unstable woman. He denied committing any of the murders and suggested that Bundy had killed the women herself and then implicated him out of spite. The jury was unimpressed by Clark's testimony, finding it cold, evasive, and entirely unconvincing. On February 5, 1983, Douglas Clark was found guilty on 6 counts of first-degree murder and was sentenced to death. He was sent to San Quentin State Prison to await execution. Carol Bundy's trial resulted in a conviction for the murder of John Murray and for being an accessory to the other killings. She was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. During her time in prison, Bundy gave a series of interviews in which she continued to portray herself as a victim of Clark's psychological manipulation, though she acknowledged her own culpability in Murray's murder. She expressed remorse for her crimes, though the sincerity of her remorse was questioned by those who noted that she had never attempted to alert authorities or stop the killings while they were happening. Carol Mary Bundy died in prison on December 9, 2003, at the age of 59, from natural causes. Douglas Clark remains on death row at San Quentin State Prison, having exhausted multiple layers of appeals over the decades. His case, like many death penalty cases in California, has been caught in the lengthy and complex appellate process that has effectively placed executions on hold in the state for many years. The case of the Sunset Strip killers had a profound impact on the Los Angeles community and on the sex worker community in particular. The targeting of prostitutes on the Sunset Strip highlighted the extreme vulnerability of women who work in the street-based sex trade, a vulnerability that was compounded by the perception among some members of the public and even some law enforcement officials that the lives of sex workers were somehow less valuable than the lives of other victims. Advocates for sex workers used the case to push for greater protections and for changes in the way police handled missing persons reports involving prostitutes, arguing that the delay in recognizing a pattern of serial killings was partly due to the lower priority assigned to crimes against sex workers. The case also contributed to the ongoing national debate about the death penalty and the psychological dynamics of killer couples. The Clark and Bundy partnership was studied extensively by criminal psychologists who were fascinated by the way in which 2 deeply damaged individuals had found each other and created a dynamic that enabled violence far beyond what either was likely capable of alone. For the families of Cynthia Chandler, Exie Wilson, Karen Jones, and the other victims, the case left wounds that never fully healed. The gruesome nature of the crimes, the violation and desecration of the victims' bodies, and the knowledge that the killings had been driven by nothing more than the depraved sexual fantasies of a man who felt entitled to take human life ensured that the memory of the Sunset Strip killers would endure as one of the darkest chapters in Los Angeles criminal history. Number 4, Alton Coleman and Deborah Brown, a duo whose 1984 multi-state rampage of terror across the American Midwest resulted in at least 8 murders, numerous rapes, kidnappings, and armed robberies, and became one of the most extensive and exhausting manhunts in the history of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Alton Coleman was born on February 6, 1955, in Waukegan, Illinois, a working-class city on the shores of Lake Michigan just north of Chicago. From the earliest stages of his life, Coleman displayed a pattern of antisocial and violent behavior that set him apart from other children and marked him as a deeply troubled individual. He was raised in a household marked by poverty, neglect, and instability, with multiple caregivers rotating in and out of his life as his mother struggled to maintain any semblance of a stable home environment. By the time he entered elementary school, Coleman was already exhibiting aggressive tendencies, bullying smaller children, stealing, and showing a complete disregard for authority. He was placed in special education classes, though these interventions did little to address the fundamental psychological deficits that drove his behavior. As Coleman progressed through adolescence, his criminal behavior escalated in both frequency and severity. He was arrested multiple times for petty crimes, including theft, vandalism, and assault, and he spent time in juvenile detention facilities where, rather than being rehabilitated, he became further entrenched in a criminal identity. Coleman developed a reputation as a smooth talker and a con artist who could manipulate people with a disarming smile and a plausible story, a skill that would serve him terrifyingly well in his adult criminal career. He was also, according to numerous accounts from those who encountered him, a man of considerable physical presence who could switch from charming to violent in a matter of seconds, a volatility that made him dangerous in ways that were difficult to predict or defend against. By the time he reached adulthood, Coleman had accumulated a lengthy criminal record that included convictions for rape, assault, and robbery. He had served time in Illinois prisons, and his experience in the correctional system did nothing to deter his criminal impulses. If anything, prison appeared to have hardened him and expanded his criminal repertoire. He was described by prison psychologists as a classic antisocial personality, a man devoid of empathy, remorse, or any capacity for genuine emotional connection with other human beings. His relationships with women were characterized by manipulation, exploitation, and violence, and he had a history of targeting vulnerable women who were psychologically or economically dependent on him. Deborah Brown was born in 1959, and her background was in many ways a study in the devastating effects of long-term abuse and psychological degradation. Brown grew up in an environment of extreme poverty and domestic violence, and she was subjected to physical, emotional, and sexual abuse throughout her childhood and adolescence. The precise details of her early abuse are grim, involving multiple perpetrators and a system that failed to protect her at every turn. By the time she reached adulthood, Deborah Brown was a profoundly damaged individual with limited intellectual functioning and a psychological profile that made her exquisitely vulnerable to exploitation by a dominant personality. She had been diagnosed by various mental health professionals with dependent personality disorder, intellectual disability, and features of borderline personality organization, though the exact diagnostic picture varied depending on the evaluator. What was consistent across all evaluations was the conclusion that Brown was a follower, a person who lacked the capacity for independent judgment and who attached herself to dominant figures in a desperate attempt to find the security and direction that her own shattered psyche could not provide. When Alton Coleman and Deborah Brown met in the early 1980s, the dynamic that formed between them was a textbook example of a dominant-submissive criminal partnership taken to its most extreme and lethal conclusion. Coleman recognized Brown's vulnerabilities immediately and moved to establish total control over her, isolating her from whatever support system she had and conditioning her to obey his commands without question. He subjected her to physical and sexual abuse, and he systematically dismantled whatever fragile boundaries she possessed, replacing them with a complete dependence on his will. Brown became, in effect, an extension of Coleman's own violent impulses, a tool that he could direct at his victims with the confidence that she would comply without hesitation. What made the Coleman and Brown case particularly terrifying was the sheer scale and speed of their rampage. Beginning in May 1984, Coleman and Brown launched a killing spree that would span 6 states, cover thousands of miles, and claim the lives of at least 8 people within a period of approximately 2 months. Their methods were brazen, opportunistic, and marked by a level of violence that seemed driven by rage rather than any calculated purpose. They targeted people of all ages, genders, and races, though there was a pattern of targeting vulnerable individuals, including elderly people, children, and those who were alone or isolated. Their spree began in their home state of Illinois, where on May 29, 1984, they encountered a 7-year-old girl named Vernita Wheat in Waukegan. Vernita was lured away from her neighborhood by Coleman, who had established himself as a familiar and non-threatening presence in the community. He took the child to an abandoned building where he sexually assaulted and murdered her. Her body was discovered several days later in an abandoned building, and the investigation initially focused on local suspects without any immediate connection to Coleman. The killing of Vernita Wheat was followed by a rapid series of attacks that sent shockwaves through multiple communities. On June 12, 1984, Coleman and Brown traveled to Gary, Indiana, where they encountered a 9-year-old girl named Tamika Turks. Tamika was playing near her home when Coleman and Brown abducted her, along with her 15-year-old aunt, who was also sexually assaulted but managed to survive the attack. Tamika Turks was brutally beaten, sexually assaulted, and murdered, her body found in a vacant lot. The survival of her aunt provided investigators with a description of the attackers, but Coleman and Brown had already fled the area, moving on to their next target with a speed and efficiency that frustrated law enforcement at every turn. The rampage continued with a horrifying intensity that seemed almost random in its victim selection. In Cincinnati, Ohio, they encountered a 44-year-old woman named Donna Williams, whom they abducted, sexually assaulted, and murdered, her body discovered in a vacant building. In Toledo, Ohio, they attacked an elderly couple, 77-year-old William and 74-year-old Virginia Robertson, in their home. Both were beaten severely, and Virginia Robertson was sexually assaulted. William Robertson died from his injuries, and Virginia survived but was left with permanent physical and psychological damage. In Ecorse, Michigan, near Detroit, they murdered a 25-year-old woman named Marlene Walters, shooting her in the head in her own home while her husband was away. In Decatur, Illinois, they abducted and murdered a 20-year-old college student named Tanya Story, her body found in a field. In Indianapolis, Indiana, they attacked a 44-year-old minister named Reverend Millard Gay and his wife, beating them both severely in a home invasion. In Wisconsin, they abducted and robbed several individuals, though they did not kill during this particular leg of their journey. In each case, the pattern was similar. Coleman and Brown would approach their victims using some combination of charm, deception, and surprise, gaining access to them through a ruse or simply overwhelming them through force. The attacks were characterized by extreme violence, including beatings, sexual assaults, and shootings, and the victims were often left in circumstances that suggested a complete indifference to whether they lived or died. The speed with which Coleman and Brown moved from one location to another, often crossing state lines within hours of an attack, made it nearly impossible for any single law enforcement agency to develop a coherent picture of what was happening. Each jurisdiction was dealing with its own horrific crime or crimes, and in the pre-digital era of 1984. The communication between police departments in different states was slow, fragmented, and often hampered by bureaucratic obstacles and jurisdictional rivalries. It was this fragmentation that allowed Coleman and Brown to stay ahead of the investigation for as long as they did. The turning point in the case came when the Federal Bureau of Investigation became involved and recognized that the seemingly disconnected murders and attacks across 6 states were the work of a single pair of offenders. The FBI deployed its resources to create a comprehensive profile of the killers and to coordinate the investigation across jurisdictions, a massive logistical undertaking that required agents in multiple field offices to share information in real time, something that was far more difficult in 1984 than it would be in later decades. Alton Coleman was added to the FBI's 10 Most Wanted Fugitives list on July 20, 1984, a designation that brought national attention to the case and placed enormous pressure on law enforcement to apprehend the pair before they could claim more victims. The manhunt that followed was one of the largest in American history up to that point, involving hundreds of officers from local, state, and federal agencies across 6 states. Tips poured in from the public, and investigators chased leads across the Midwest, but Coleman and Brown proved to be elusive, moving constantly, changing vehicles, and using aliases to avoid detection. They survived by stealing money, food, and vehicles from their victims, and they often stayed with people they encountered who were deceived by Coleman's charm and unaware of the horror that followed him. The end of the rampage came on July 26, 1984, in Evanston, Illinois, just miles from where it had begun. Coleman and Brown were recognized by a woman who had seen their photographs on the news and on wanted posters distributed throughout the area. The woman called police, and officers from the Evanston Police Department responded immediately. Coleman and Brown were found walking down a residential street, and when officers attempted to apprehend them, Coleman initially tried to flee but was quickly subdued. Deborah Brown offered no resistance. Both were taken into custody without further incident. The arrest of Alton Coleman and Deborah Brown brought an end to a nightmare that had terrorized the Midwest for 2 months, but it was only the beginning of a lengthy and complex legal process that would play out across multiple states over the course of several years. Because the crimes had been committed in 6 different states, prosecutors in each jurisdiction had to decide whether to bring charges and in what order, a process that required extensive coordination between state and federal authorities. Coleman was tried first in Ohio, where he was convicted of the murder of Donna Williams and sentenced to death. He was then extradited to Indiana, where he was convicted of the murders of Tamika Turks and Vernita Wheat and received additional death sentences. Brown was tried alongside Coleman in some jurisdictions and separately in others. In Ohio, she was convicted of aggravated murder and sentenced to death for her role in the killing of Donna Williams. It was Brown's death sentence in Ohio that became the subject of one of the most controversial clemency decisions in the state's history. Brown's attorneys mounted a vigorous defense that focused on her intellectual disabilities, her history of severe abuse, and the psychological dynamic of her relationship with Coleman. They presented extensive evidence from mental health professionals documenting Brown's dependent personality disorder and her limited cognitive functioning, arguing that she was essentially a puppet who had been controlled by Coleman and who lacked the capacity to form the specific intent required for a death penalty conviction. The defense presented testimony from psychologists who had evaluated Brown and concluded that she was unable to distinguish right from wrong in the context of Coleman's commands and that she had been so thoroughly psychologically subjugated that her free will had been effectively extinguished. Prosecutors countered that Brown had been an active and willing participant in the crimes, that she had been present during the murders, had assisted in abducting victims, and had in some cases initiated violence on her own. They pointed to evidence that Brown had beaten victims and that she had shown no remorse during police interrogations. The jury rejected the defense's arguments and recommended death, and the judge sentenced Brown accordingly. However, in January 1991, Ohio Governor Richard Celeste commuted Brown's death sentence to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, citing concerns about her mental capacity and the fairness of her trial. The commutation was based on a review of the case by the Ohio Parole Board, which had recommended clemency by a vote of 5-2 after hearing extensive testimony about Brown's psychological profile and her history of abuse. The decision was enormously controversial, drawing sharp criticism from the families of the victims, law enforcement officials, and politicians who argued that Brown's participation in the rampage warranted the ultimate punishment regardless of her psychological deficits. Supporters of the commutation argued that executing a woman with Brown's level of intellectual disability would violate constitutional protections against cruel and unusual punishment and that the state should not be in the business of executing people who lacked the capacity to fully understand their actions. Alton Coleman was executed by lethal injection on April 26, 2002, at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility in Lucasville, Ohio. His execution came 18 years after his arrest, following a lengthy appeals process that had wound through both state and federal courts. Coleman maintained his innocence to the end, though his protestations were contradicted by overwhelming physical evidence, witness testimony, and his own statements to investigators. Deborah Brown remains incarcerated in Ohio, serving her life sentence without the possibility of parole. The case of Alton Coleman and Deborah Brown forced significant changes in the way law enforcement agencies handle multi-jurisdictional serial crime investigations. The difficulty that police departments experienced in connecting the dots between attacks in different states highlighted the critical need for better information sharing systems, and the case became one of the primary drivers behind the expansion and improvement of the FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program and the development of the National Crime Information Center's ability to track serial offenders across state lines. The case also forced a difficult and ongoing national conversation about the criminal responsibility of individuals with intellectual disabilities and severe psychological damage, a conversation that continues to this day in courts and legislatures across the country. For the families of Vernita Wheat, Tamika Turks, Donna Williams, William Robertson, Marlene Walters, Tanya Story, and all the other victims whose lives were destroyed or forever altered by Coleman and Brown, the legal proceedings brought a form of accountability but could never restore what had been taken. The communities that were terrorized during that long, hot summer of 1984 were left with scars that took years to heal, and the names Alton Coleman and Deborah Brown became synonymous in the Midwest with the kind of random, senseless, and overwhelming violence that can strike anywhere, at any time, without warning or explanation. Number 5, Paul Kenneth Bernardo and Carla Leanne Homolka, a case that horrified the entire nation of Canada and sent shockwaves around the world, exposing the incomprehensible cruelty that a couple could inflict upon innocent young women, including a member of Carla's own family, while maintaining a facade of suburban normalcy that allowed them to evade detection for years. Paul Bernardo was born on August 27, 1964, in Scarborough, Ontario, a suburban community on the eastern edge of Toronto. His birth name was Paul Kenneth Teal, but he was later revealed to be the illegitimate son of a woman named Marilyn Bernardo who had been impregnated by a married man named Kenneth Teal, a fact that was kept from Paul for much of his childhood and that may have contributed to the identity confusion and emotional instability that characterized his early life. Marilyn Bernardo raised Paul with the help of her parents, and the family environment was reportedly tense and dysfunctional, with Marilyn being described as emotionally volatile and prone to episodes of depression and anger. Paul's relationship with his mother was complex and deeply troubled, with elements of both intense attachment and simmering resentment that would later be analyzed by multiple psychologists attempting to understand the origins of his violent behavior. As a child and adolescent, Paul Bernardo was outwardly attractive, popular, and seemingly well-adjusted, a star athlete in high school who excelled at sports and was well-liked by his peers. Beneath this polished exterior, however, disturbing patterns were already emerging. Bernardo developed a fascination with sexual violence and domination at an early age, and by the time he was a young adult, he had begun acting on these impulses in increasingly dangerous ways. In the late 1980s, Bernardo began a series of violent sexual assaults on women in the Scarborough area, attacks that were characterized by a level of brutality and a specific modus operandi that suggested a deeply organized and escalating predatory pattern. The perpetrator, who became known in the media as the Scarborough Rapist, would approach women in parking lots, near bus stops, or in other relatively isolated but public settings, produce a knife, and sexually assault them while subjecting them to degrading and humiliating verbal abuse. The attacks were meticulously planned, with Bernardo demonstrating an awareness of surveillance cameras, escape routes, and the importance of not leaving physical evidence that was remarkably sophisticated for a serial offender operating in that era. Over a period of approximately 3 years, from 1987 to 1990, the Scarborough Rapist attacked at least 14 women, though the actual number may have been higher, as sexual assault is historically an underreported crime and some victims may have chosen not to come forward. The investigation into the Scarborough Rapist was one of the largest in the history of the Toronto Police Service, involving dozens of detectives, extensive neighborhood canvasses, composite sketches distributed to the public, and the use of psychological profiling techniques that were still in their relative infancy in Canadian law enforcement. Despite these efforts, the investigation stalled for years. Bernardo was actually interviewed by police during the investigation, as a witness rather than a suspect, and he was even asked to provide a DNA sample, which he did voluntarily. At the time, however, the forensic technology available to Canadian law enforcement was not sufficient to process the sample quickly enough to generate a match, and the sample sat in a laboratory for years, unanalyzed, while Bernardo continued to hunt. Carla Homolka was born on May 4, 1970, in Port Credit, Ontario, a lakeside community in the Toronto area, and her background appeared to be the polar opposite of the darkness that would later define her life. She was raised in a stable, middle-class family with two younger sisters, Lori and Tammy, and by all outward accounts, her childhood was happy and unremarkable. Carla was an attractive, bubbly, and popular girl who did well in school, was active in extracurricular activities, and was regarded by those who knew her as a kind and caring person. She worked part-time as a veterinary assistant, a job that suited her apparent love of animals, and she was seen by her friends and family as someone who had a bright and promising future ahead of her. When Carla met Paul Bernardo at a pet industry convention in Toronto in October 1987, she was 17 years old and he was 23. The attraction was immediate and intense on both sides. Bernardo, who was exceptionally handsome and charismatic, swept Carla off her feet with a level of attention and romantic intensity that she found intoxicating. What Carla did not know at the time, and what she would later claim to have discovered gradually, was that the charming, successful man she was falling in love with was the Scarborough rapist. According to Homolka's later testimony, Bernardo eventually confessed to her that he was the rapist, and rather than being horrified and going to the police, Carla made a fateful decision that would lead to unimaginable consequences. She chose to stay with him, to protect his secret, and eventually to participate in his violent fantasies. The psychological dynamic between Bernardo and Homolka has been the subject of extensive analysis and debate, with some experts viewing Homolka as a victim of severe coercive control and others seeing her as a willing and enthusiastic participant who was far more culpable than she admitted. What is clear is that Bernardo was a master manipulator who recognized Carla's desire to please and her fear of losing him, and he exploited these vulnerabilities with devastating effectiveness. He introduced her to increasingly extreme sexual practices, including bondage, sadomasochism, and the use of illegal drugs to lower inhibitions. He told Carla that his ultimate fantasy was to have sex with a virgin, specifically a young virgin, and he pressed Carla to help him fulfill this desire. In a decision that defies comprehension, Carla agreed to provide him with her own 15-year-old sister, Tammy Lynn Homolka. On December 23, 1990, 2 days before Christmas, Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka carried out a plan to drug Tammy Homolka with animal tranquilizers that Carla had stolen from the veterinary clinic where she worked. The plan was to render Tammy unconscious so that Bernardo could sexually assault her while Carla filmed the act with a video camera that the couple had set up in the Homolka family basement. Tammy, who had been given the drugs mixed with alcohol, became severely intoxicated and semi-conscious, and Bernardo proceeded to sexually assault her while Carla watched and recorded. At some point during the assault, Tammy began to convulse and choke on her own vomit. Rather than call for help or take Tammy to a hospital, Bernardo and Carla attempted to cover up what had happened, cleaning the scene and moving Tammy to her bedroom. They called 911 only when it became clear that Tammy was not breathing. Tammy Homolka was pronounced dead at a local hospital, and her death was initially attributed to accidental aspiration of vomit while intoxicated, a conclusion that the attending physician and the police accepted without conducting the kind of thorough investigation that might have revealed the true circumstances. Tammy's death was classified as a tragic accident, and no charges were filed. The fact that Bernardo and Homolka got away with what amounted to the rape and murder of Carla's own sister gave them a terrifying sense of invulnerability and emboldened them to escalate their predation to a new level of depravity. Less than 4 months after Tammy's death, on April 16, 1991, Bernardo and Homolka abducted a 14-year-old girl named Leslie Erin Mahaffey. Leslie had been locked out of her home after a late-night argument with her parents and was sitting on the front porch of a friend's house when Bernardo approached her. He forced her into his car at knife point and drove her to the home he shared with Carla in Port Dalhousie, a neighborhood in St. Catharines, Ontario, where the couple had moved after their wedding in 1991. Over the course of the next 24 hours, Leslie Mahaffey was subjected to hours of sexual torture, repeatedly assaulted by both Bernardo and Homolka while the couple filmed their actions with the same video camera they had used on Tammy Homolka. Leslie was bound, blindfolded, and forced to endure acts of degradation that are almost impossible to describe without descending into the kind of gratuitous detail that serves no purpose other than to shock. After hours of abuse, Bernardo murdered Leslie, strangling her with an electrical cord. He and Homolka then dismembered her body with a circular saw, encased the pieces in cement, and dumped the concrete blocks in a lake near the Burlington Skyway, a major highway bridge in the Greater Toronto Area. The blocks were discovered by a passerby on June 29, 1991, nearly 2.5 months after Leslie's disappearance, and it took investigators weeks to identify the remains and connect them to the missing teenager. Less than a year after the murder of Leslie Mahaffey, on April 16, 1992, exactly 1 year to the day after Leslie's abduction, Bernardo and Homolka struck again. Their victim was 15-year-old Kristen Dawn French, a bright, athletic, and well-liked student at Holy Cross Secondary School in St. Catharines. Kristen was walking home from school when Bernardo forced her into his car at knife point, apparently at random, in a church parking lot. Karla Homolka was in the car and participated in the abduction. They drove Kristen to their home on Bayview Drive in St. Catharines, where she was subjected to the same pattern of prolonged sexual torture and abuse that Leslie Mahaffey had endured. Over the course of approximately 3 days, Kristen was repeatedly sexually assaulted by both Bernardo and Homolka, and the attacks were again recorded on video. Despite the horror of her situation, Kristen showed extraordinary courage and resilience, telling her captors her full name and providing them with information about herself, a deliberate strategy to ensure that her body would be identified if she did not survive. After 3 days of captivity, Bernardo murdered Kristen French, strangling her from behind with a rope. He and Homolka then drove her body to a ditch in a rural area near the town of Burlington, approximately 30 miles from St. Catharines, where they left her naked and exposed. Her body was discovered on April 30, 1992, 2 weeks after her abduction, by a groundskeeper mowing grass alongside a rural road. The discovery of Kristen French's body, coming less than a year after the discovery of Leslie Mahaffey's remains, ignited a firestorm of public outrage and fear in the Niagara region and across Canada. Police were now dealing with what was clearly a pattern of predatory abductions and murders of teenage girls, and the pressure on law enforcement to find the killer or killers was immense. The investigation, which came to be known as the Green Ribbon Task Force, involved hundreds of officers from multiple police services and the Ontario Provincial Police, working in what was at the time the largest murder investigation in Canadian history. The breakthrough in the case came through a series of events that no one could have predicted. In February 1993, Paul Bernardo, who had a long history of physically abusing Karla Homolka, beat her severely with a flashlight during an argument, causing injuries to her face and head that required medical attention. For reasons that remain the subject of speculation, Karla did not go to the hospital or call the police immediately. Instead, she left Bernardo and went to stay with family members. During this separation, Bernardo's behavior became increasingly erratic and reckless, and he began calling Karla repeatedly, making threats and demands. It was during this period that Karla Homolka contacted a lawyer and, in a stunning reversal, offered to cooperate with investigators in exchange for a favorable plea arrangement. She told her lawyer that she had information about the murders of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French and that she could identify the killer. When investigators interviewed Homolka, she presented herself as a battered woman who had been trapped in a relationship with a violent psychopath and who had participated in the crimes only out of fear for her own life. She told a version of events that minimized her role in the abductions and murders, portraying herself as a reluctant and terrified bystander who had been unable to stop Bernardo or escape his control. Based on Homolka's statements and the evidence available at the time, prosecutors in Ontario made a decision that would become one of the most controversial in Canadian legal history. In May 1993, Karla Homolka signed a plea agreement under which she pleaded guilty to 2 counts of manslaughter in the deaths of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French and received a sentence of 12 years in prison. In exchange, she agreed to testify against Paul Bernardo at his trial. The deal was negotiated without a full examination of the videotapes that Bernardo and Homolka had made of their crimes, tapes whose existence Homolka had not revealed to prosecutors. The prosecution believed, based on Homolka's statements, that she was a less culpable participant who had acted under duress, and they structured the plea agreement accordingly. Paul Bernardo was arrested on February 17, 1993, not initially for the murders but in connection with the Scarborough rapist investigation, after advances in DNA technology finally allowed the sample he had provided years earlier to be processed and matched to forensic evidence from the rape cases. He was subsequently charged with the murders of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French. The trial of Paul Bernardo began in May 1995 in St. Catharines, Ontario, and it quickly became apparent that the prosecution's understanding of the case had been fundamentally incomplete when they negotiated the plea agreement with Homolka. During the investigation of Bernardo's home, detectives had discovered the videotapes that Bernardo and Homolka had made of their attacks on Leslie Mahaffey, Kristen French, and Tammy Homolka. The content of these tapes was devastating, not only for the graphic horror of what they depicted but for what they revealed about Karla Homolka's actual role in the crimes. Far from being a passive, terrified bystander, Homolka appeared on the tapes as an active, willing, and at times enthusiastic participant in the sexual torture of the victims. She was seen engaging in sexual acts with the victims, encouraging Bernardo, and demonstrating a level of comfort and agency that was completely inconsistent with the picture of a coerced and frightened woman that she had presented to prosecutors. The tapes also revealed that Homolka had been the one who had obtained the animal tranquilizers used to drug Tammy Homolka and who had actively participated in the plan to drug and assault her sister. The revelation of the tape's contents caused a national scandal in Canada. The public was outraged to learn that Homolka, who had been portrayed in the media as a victim, had in fact been a willing participant in some of the most heinous crimes in Canadian history and that she had received a sentence of only 12 years in exchange for her testimony. The controversy surrounding the plea agreement, which became known as the Deal with the Devil, dominated Canadian news for months and led to a comprehensive review of the prosecution's handling of the case. Despite the damage done by the tapes to Homolka's credibility, her testimony at Bernardo's trial was still a central component of the prosecution's case, as the tapes, while damning, did not show the actual moments of the murders, which Homolka had witnessed and could describe. Bernardo's defense team attempted to portray Homolka as the true mastermind behind the crimes, arguing that she had manipulated Bernardo and that she was the more dangerous and culpable of the two. The jury was not persuaded by this defense. On September 1, 1995, Paul Bernardo was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder in the deaths of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French, 1 count of aggravated sexual assault, and numerous other charges related to the Scarborough rapes. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with no possibility of parole for 25 years, and he was subsequently declared a dangerous offender, which means that even if he were ever granted parole, he could be held indefinitely. Bernardo is currently serving his sentence at Millhaven Institution, a maximum security federal penitentiary in Ontario. And he has been repeatedly denied parole at hearings where his lack of remorse and the ongoing risk he poses to the community have been cited as reasons for denial. Karla Homolka served her 12-year sentence and was released from prison on July 4, 2005. Her release was met with intense public opposition and media scrutiny, and there were widespread calls for the government to find a legal mechanism to keep her incarcerated. Despite the public outcry, Homolka had fulfilled the terms of her sentence and was legally entitled to her freedom. She subsequently changed her name, moved to Quebec, married a man she had corresponded with while in prison, and had children. Her attempts to live a private life have been repeatedly disrupted by media attention and public outrage, and her current whereabouts are the subject of ongoing interest and controversy. The Bernardo Homolka case had a profound and lasting impact on the Canadian criminal justice system. The controversy surrounding the plea agreement with Homolka led to significant reforms in the way prosecutors handle plea bargains in serious cases, including requirements for more thorough disclosure of evidence before plea agreements are finalized. The case also prompted a national conversation about domestic violence, coercive control, and the capacity of women to commit acts of extreme violence, a conversation that challenged prevailing assumptions about gender and criminality. For the families of Tammy Homolka, Leslie Mahaffey, and Kristen French, The case was a tragedy beyond measure, compounded by the knowledge that the person who had helped plan and carry out the murders had received a sentence that many viewed as grossly disproportionate to her culpability. The Mahaffey and French families became vocal advocates for victims' rights and for changes to the criminal justice system, and their courage in the face of unimaginable loss earned them the respect and admiration of the Canadian public. The case remains the most notorious criminal case in Canadian history, a reference point for discussions about justice, evil, and the terrible things that can happen behind the closed doors of a seemingly ordinary suburban home. Number 6, Frederick Walter Stephen West and Rosemary Pauline West, a married couple whose decades-long campaign of torture, sexual violence, and murder at their home at 25 Cromwell Street in Gloucester, England, produced what the British press accurately and horrifically described as a house of horrors. A case that exposed the failure of multiple institutions to protect vulnerable women and children, and that remains the most notorious criminal case in modern British history. Frederick West was born on September 29, 1941, in the village of Much Marcle in Herefordshire, a rural area in western England near the border with Wales. He was the first of 7 children born to Walter and Daisy West, and the family lived in a small, cramped cottage called Bide a While, which sat on a modest parcel of agricultural land. The West family was poor, even by the standards of rural wartime and post-war Britain, and the household was governed by a harsh and authoritarian patriarch. Walter West was a strict disciplinarian who ruled his family through a combination of physical violence and psychological intimidation, and his treatment of his children would later be cited by psychologists and social historians as a critical factor in the development of Frederick's own violent tendencies. Fred's mother, Daisy, was reportedly a passive woman who was herself subjected to Walter's abuse and who was unable or unwilling to protect her children from her husband's rages. In addition to the physical violence that permeated the West household, there was evidence of severe sexual abuse. Fred West later claimed, and some investigators and psychologists believed, that he was subjected to incest by his mother, a claim that Daisy West vehemently denied until her death. Whether the incest actually occurred or was a fabrication created by Fred to justify his own behavior has never been definitively established, but the sexualization of the family environment was a consistent theme in Fred's upbringing. Fred was a poor student who disliked school and preferred the company of animals, developing a particular affinity for handling and slaughtering livestock on the family's smallholding. He became skilled at butchering animals at a young age, a skill that would later take on a deeply sinister significance. He left school at 15 with no qualifications and drifted through a series of manual labor jobs, including work on farms, in slaughterhouses, and in construction. As a young man, Fred was known in his local community as a likable but rough-edged character who was quick with a joke and willing to lend a hand, but who also had a disturbing tendency toward violence, particularly toward women. His first known criminal behavior involved an incident with a 13-year-old girl, for which he was arrested but not prosecuted, a failure of the criminal justice system that would have devastating downstream consequences. In 1962, Fred West met a 16-year-old girl named Rena Costello, a local girl of Irish traveler heritage who was pregnant with another man's child when they began their relationship. Fred married Rena, and she gave birth to a daughter, Charmaine, shortly after the wedding. A second daughter, Anna Marie, followed, and Fred claimed paternity, though the true parentage of both girls has been the subject of some dispute. The marriage between Fred and Rena was turbulent and violent from the beginning, with Fred subjecting Rena to beatings, sexual violence, and coercive control. Rena was a troubled young woman with her own psychological difficulties, and she was in no position to resist or escape Fred's dominance. The family moved frequently, living in a series of rented accommodations in the Gloucester area, and during this period, Fred's violent and sexual offending escalated. In 1965, Rena Costello disappeared. Fred told various stories about her departure, claiming that she had left him for another man and moved to London, and at the time, no serious investigation was conducted into her disappearance. Rena's family, who were marginalized and distrustful of authority, did not mount an effective campaign to find her, and she was essentially written off as a woman who had chosen to abandon her family. In reality, Rena had been murdered by Fred West, though the full truth of her death would not emerge for nearly 30 years. At around the same time that Rena disappeared, Fred also killed Charmaine, his stepdaughter, who was approximately 8 years old. Charmaine's death was hidden by Fred, who told people, including his subsequent partners, that Rena had come back and taken the child with her. Rosemary Pauline Letts was born on November 29, 1953, in Northam, Devon, a town in southwestern England, and her childhood, while very different from Fred's in its specifics, produced a psychological profile that was in some ways disturbingly complementary to his. Rose was the fifth of 7 children born to Bill and Daisy Letts. Bill Letts was a man with a diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia who suffered from severe mental illness throughout Rose's childhood, was frequently institutionalized, and was reportedly violent and abusive toward his family during his episodes of decompensation. Daisy Letts, Rose's mother, was a dominant, controlling woman who has been described by various sources as both protective and suffocating, and who may have suffered from Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a condition in which a caregiver fabricates or induces illness in a child to gain attention and sympathy. Rose was reportedly a sickly child who was frequently taken to doctors and hospitals by her mother, though the extent to which her illnesses were genuine versus manufactured remains unclear. As an adolescent, Rose developed into an attractive but troubled young woman who exhibited signs of emotional instability, promiscuity, and a fascination with violence and death that disturbed those around her. She performed poorly in school, left without qualifications, and found work in a series of low-skilled jobs, including a position at a bakery and later at a care home for the elderly. It was at the care home that Rose's behavior first crossed the line into criminality, as she was discovered to have been physically abusing elderly residents, subjecting them to unnecessary roughness and, in at least one instance, sexual assault. Despite these disturbing incidents, no formal criminal charges were filed against Rose at the time, a failure of oversight that, like the failure to prosecute Fred West for his earlier offenses, would have catastrophic consequences. Rose met Fred West in the late 1960s, when she was approximately 15 years old and he was in his late 20s. Fred, who had recently moved to the Gloucester area, was immediately drawn to Rose's youth, her sexual availability, and the aura of damaged vulnerability that surrounded her. Rose, for her part, was captivated by Fred's rough masculinity, his confidence, and the attention he lavished on her. Despite a significant age gap and the concerns of Rose's family, the relationship progressed rapidly, and Rose moved in with Fred, who was by this time living alone with Anna Marie, the daughter from his marriage to Rena Costello. Fred's 8-year-old stepdaughter, Charmaine, was no longer present, having been murdered and buried in the cellar of a previous residence, a fact that Rose would later claim not to have known at the time, though this claim was viewed with extreme skepticism by investigators. Rose and Fred were married in January 1972, and over the course of the next 2 decades, they had 8 children together, while Rose also raised Anna Marie as her own. The West family settled at 25 Cromwell Street in Gloucester in the early 1970s, moving into a 3-story mid-terrace house that Fred had purchased and begun renovating. Cromwell Street was an unremarkable residential street in a working-class area of Gloucester, and the West home looked no different from its neighbors from the outside. Inside, however, it was being transformed into a chamber of horrors. Fred, utilizing the butchering skills he had learned as a child on the family farm, began excavating the cellar and the ground floor of the house, creating hidden chambers and burial spaces beneath the concrete floor. He told neighbors that the excavations were for home improvements, and no one thought to question him. The murders at Cromwell Street began long before the house became the West family home, and the total number of victims attributed to Fred and Rose West is at least 12, though some investigators and commentators have suggested that the true number could be higher. The earliest known victims were Rena Costello and Charmaine West, who were killed in 1965 and buried at a previous residence on Midland Road in Gloucester. Their bodies were discovered in 1994 during the investigation that ultimately brought down the Wests. The first victim buried at Cromwell Street was a young woman named Linda Goff, who was a friend of Anna Marie West and who disappeared in 1973 after moving into the Cromwell Street house as a lodger. Linda was murdered by Fred and Rose and buried in the cellar. Over the following years, at least 9 more young women and girls were abducted, tortured, sexually assaulted, and murdered by the Wests, their bodies buried in the cellar, the ground floor, and the garden of 25 Cromwell Street. The victims included Carol and Cooper, who disappeared in 1973, Lucy Partington, a university student who vanished in 1973, Therese Siegenthaler, a Swiss national who disappeared in 1974, Shirley Hubbard, who vanished in 1975, Juanita Mott, who disappeared in 1975, Shirley Robinson, who was pregnant with Fred West's child when she was murdered in 1978, Allison Chambers, who disappeared in 1979, and a 15-year-old girl whose identity has never been definitively confirmed but who is believed to be a young woman from the Gloucester area who went missing in the late 1970s. The pattern of the West's crimes followed a consistent and terrifying template. Fred and Rose would lure young women to Cromwell Street through a combination of charm, offers of work or accommodation, and the apparent normalcy of their family life. Once a woman was inside the house, she was subjected to prolonged sessions of sexual torture, bondage, and degradation, often involving both Fred and Rose as participants. The victims were then murdered, most commonly by strangulation, and their bodies were buried in the hidden chambers that Fred had constructed throughout the property. The West's ability to continue their killing spree for nearly 2 decades without detection was the result of a catastrophic failure on the part of multiple institutions and individuals. Their victims were, with few exceptions, young women who were vulnerable in some way, women who were runaways, sex workers, students from out of town, or women with mental health difficulties who were unlikely to be missed quickly or whose absence would not trigger an urgent police response. The Gloucestershire Constabulary, the local police force, was criticized heavily in the aftermath of the case for its failure to investigate disappearances adequately and for its dismissive attitude toward the families of missing women, particularly families from marginalized backgrounds. Social services also came under intense scrutiny for their failure to protect the West children, who were living in a home where horrific violence and sexual abuse were routine and where the risk of harm was extreme and obvious to anyone who looked carefully. There were numerous opportunities for authorities to intervene over the years, including reports from neighbors about suspicious activity at Cromwell Street, concerns raised by teachers about the West children's behavior and appearance, and instances where victims' families directly appealed to the police for help in finding their missing loved ones. In every case, the system failed to act with the urgency and thoroughness that the circumstances demanded. The investigation that finally brought the Wests to justice began in February 1994, when Detective Superintendent John Bennett of the Gloucestershire Constabulary initiated a search of Cromwell Street based on new information that had emerged in connection with the long-standing investigation into the disappearances of young women in the Gloucester area. The catalyst for the search was the receipt of information suggesting that the remains of one or more missing women might be buried on the property. Police obtained a search warrant and began excavating the cellar and the garden of 25 Cromwell Street on February 24, 1994. What they found over the coming days and weeks exceeded the worst fears of even the most experienced investigators. The first human remains were discovered in the cellar almost immediately, and as the excavation continued, more and more bodies were uncovered, each one wrapped in plastic sheeting or buried in a shallow grave beneath the concrete floor. The sheer number of bodies, the evidence of torture and sexual violence that accompanied them, and the realization that these horrors had been taking place inside a family home in a residential neighborhood for 2 decades created a level of shock and revulsion that was almost unprecedented in British criminal history. Fred West was arrested on February 28, 1994, and charged with multiple counts of murder. Rose West was arrested several days later. During police interviews, Fred West initially denied any knowledge of the bodies, but as the evidence mounted, he began to make partial admissions, eventually confessing to the murders but claiming that Rose had been the driving force behind the killings and that she had been the one who had actually killed many of the victims. Rose West maintained her innocence throughout the investigation and the trial, denying any involvement in the murders and claiming that Fred had acted alone. On January 1, 1995, while awaiting trial at HMP Winson Green in Birmingham, Frederick West used a blanket to hang himself in his prison cell. His death was discovered by guards during a routine check, and despite some conspiracy theories that circulated in the media and among the public, multiple investigations, including one conducted by the prison service, concluded that his death was a straightforward suicide. Fred West's suicide denied the families of the victims the opportunity to see him face justice in a courtroom, a fact that compounded their grief and frustration. The trial of Rose West began on October 2, 1995, at Winchester Crown Court, and it was one of the most heavily covered criminal trials in British history. The prosecution presented a mountain of forensic evidence, including the remains of the victims, the testimony of survivors including Anna Marie West, who described years of horrific abuse at the hands of both Fred and Rose, and detailed circumstantial evidence linking Rose to the murders. The defense argued that Rose had been a victim of Fred's violence and manipulation and that she had not participated in the killings. The jury deliberated for approximately 8 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on 10 counts of murder on November 21, 1995. The judge, Mr. Justice Wright, sentenced Rose West to life imprisonment with a whole life order, meaning that she will never be considered for parole and will die in prison. She is currently incarcerated at HMP Low Newton in County Durham. The case of Fred and Rose West prompted a comprehensive and far-reaching public inquiry into the failures of the police, social services, and other institutions that had allowed the Wests to operate with impunity for so long. The resulting report, which was highly critical of the Gloucestershire Constabulary in particular, led to significant reforms in the way British police investigate missing persons cases and in the way social services monitor at-risk children and families. The house at 25 Cromwell Street was demolished in 1996, and the site was turned into a memorial garden, a physical erasure of the place where so much evil had been contained. For the families of the victims, the case left wounds that could never fully heal, compounded by the knowledge that their loved ones had suffered unimaginably and that their disappearances had been ignored or mishandled by the authorities who should have protected them. The West case forced Britain to confront the uncomfortable reality that evil does not always announce itself with dramatic fanfare but can fester quietly behind the most ordinary of facades, in the most unremarkable of neighborhoods, for years and decades, invisible to all but those who suffer within its walls. Number 7, Ian Brady and Myra Hindley, a partnership in evil that produced what are arguably the most infamous murders in British criminal history, the abduction, torture, sexual abuse, and murder of 5 children and teenagers whose bodies were buried on the desolate expanse of Saddleworth Moor in the Pennine Hills of northern England, a case that shattered the post-war British assumption that such monstrous crimes were something that happened in other countries but never at home. Ian Brady was born Ian Duncan Stewart on January 2, 1938, in the Gorbals district of Glasgow, Scotland, one of the most notoriously impoverished and violent slums in Europe at the time. His mother, Margaret Stewart, was an unmarried waitress who was unable to care for her infant son, and within months of his birth, Ian was placed in the care of a local couple named John and Mary Sloane, who took in illegitimate children for payment. The Sloanes were a working-class couple who provided basic physical care but little in the way of emotional warmth or stability, and Ian's early life was marked by the absence of any consistent parental bond. He would later learn that the woman he believed to be his older sister was in fact his mother, a revelation that reportedly deepened his sense of alienation and betrayal. Brady grew up in the brutal environment of the Gorbals, where violence was a daily reality and survival required a capacity for aggression that Brady developed to an extraordinary degree. As a boy, he was involved in frequent fights, petty crime, and acts of cruelty to animals, including cats and birds, behaviors that are now recognized as classic warning signs of a developing antisocial personality but that were at the time largely dismissed as boys being boys. Brady was intelligent but academically unmotivated, and he left school with minimal qualifications. As a young man, he drifted through a series of jobs, including work as a butcher's assistant, a laborer, and a clerk, and he developed an interest in books that was unusual for his background, reading extensively in philosophy, history, and particularly in the works of the Marquis de Sade, Friedrich Nietzsche, and other writers who celebrated cruelty, power, and the rejection of conventional morality. Brady absorbed these ideas and constructed for himself a personal philosophy that regarded compassion as weakness, empathy as a defect, and the infliction of suffering as a legitimate expression of personal power. He became fascinated with Nazi Germany, admiring its ideology of racial superiority and its systematic use of violence as an instrument of state policy, and he studied the methods of serial killers with the detached interest of a scholar examining a subject of academic curiosity. By the time he reached his 20s, Brady had developed a criminal record that included charges of theft and burglary, and he had served a short prison sentence. It was after his release from prison that he moved to Manchester, in northern England, to start a new life, and it was there that he found employment at a chemical distribution company called Millward's Merchandising in the Ancoats district of the city. Myra Hindley was born on July 23, 1942, in Gorton, a working-class neighborhood in Manchester, and her early life, while very different from Brady's in its specifics, produced a young woman who was psychologically primed to become his willing accomplice. Myra was raised in a conventional working-class Catholic family, the older of two daughters born to Bob and Nellie Hindley. Bob Hindley was a former soldier who had served in the Second World War and who returned from the conflict with a drinking problem and a violent temper that he directed primarily at his wife and children. Nellie Hindley was a woman of strong religious convictions who endured her husband's abuse with a passive resignation that would later be cited as a powerful influence on Myra's understanding of relationships, power, and the normalcy of male violence against women. Myra was a pretty, intelligent child who did well in primary school and was regarded by her teachers as a capable student with potential. However, her academic performance declined as she entered adolescence, partly due to the disruptive and frightening atmosphere of her home life and partly due to her growing preoccupation with social life and boys. She left school at 15 without qualifications and took a series of clerical and secretarial jobs. By all outward appearances, Myra Hindley was a normal, if somewhat unremarkable, young working-class woman. She dyed her hair blonde, wore fashionable clothes, enjoyed dancing and music, and was popular enough among her peers to have a steady circle of friends. Beneath this conventional exterior, however, Myra harbored a deep well of resentment, anger, and dissatisfaction with her life and her circumstances that made her vulnerable to the influence of a dominant personality who could offer her a sense of purpose and excitement. When Ian Brady arrived at Millward's Merchandising in 1961 and was assigned to work alongside Myra Hindley, the attraction between them was immediate and intense, though it was an attraction rooted not in genuine affection but in a shared capacity for darkness. Brady, who was 4 years older than Myra and possessed a quiet, brooding intelligence that set him apart from the other men in the office, recognized in Myra a pliable and suggestible personality that could be shaped and molded to serve his purposes. He began a deliberate campaign of psychological seduction, introducing Myra to the books and ideas that had shaped his own worldview, taking her to see foreign films with violent or transgressive themes, and gradually pulling her away from her family, her friends, and the conventional moral framework that had previously governed her life. Myra was captivated by Brady in a way that went beyond romantic infatuation. She saw him as brilliant, sophisticated, and possessing a depth and authenticity that she felt was lacking in everyone else she knew. She began to adopt his views, his mannerisms, and his contempt for ordinary society, and she transformed her appearance to match his preferred image of her, bleaching her hair platinum blonde and dressing in dark, severe clothing that gave her a hard, angular look that was at odds with the cheerful working-class femininity of her earlier years. Myra's family was alarmed by the changes in her behavior and her appearance, and they attempted to intervene, but their efforts were rebuffed with a vehemence that surprised and hurt them. Myra had made her choice, and she had chosen Brady over everyone and everything else in her life. The transformation of Myra Hindley from a conventional young woman into a participant in the murder of children was gradual but relentless, driven by Brady's systematic destruction of her existing psychological frameworks and his replacement of those frameworks with a value system that regarded the suffering of others as insignificant and the taking of life as an expression of power and freedom. Brady convinced Myra that the conventional moral categories of good and evil were illusions created by a weak and hypocritical society to control the strong, and that true freedom lay in the complete rejection of these constraints. He introduced her to his fantasy of committing the perfect murder, a murder that would demonstrate their superiority over the masses and that would provide them with an experience of transcendent power. Myra, whose own psychological boundaries had been eroded by years of exposure to domestic violence and whose need for Brady's approval had become the organizing principle of her existence, accepted this logic and agreed to help him carry it out. The first known victim of Ian Brady and Myra Hindley was a 16-year-old girl named Pauline Reed, who disappeared on July 12, 1963, on her way to a dance at a local church hall in the Gorton area of Manchester. Pauline was a quiet, conscientious girl who lived on the same street as the Hindley family and who knew Myra casually. Hindley approached Pauline and asked her to help her search for a lost glove on the moors, a seemingly innocent request that Pauline, who had no reason to suspect ill intent from a neighbor she recognized, agreed to. Hindley drove Pauline to Saddleworth Moor, a vast, bleak expanse of peat bog and heather-covered hills approximately 15 miles northeast of Manchester, where Brady was waiting. Pauline was then subjected to a sexual assault and murdered, though the exact circumstances of her death were never fully established because her body was not discovered until 1987, more than 2 decades later. The second victim was a 12-year-old boy named John Kilbride, who disappeared on November 23, 1963, after being seen at a market in Ashton-under-Lyne, a town near Manchester. John was a friendly, trusting boy from a large family, and he had been given some pocket money to buy Christmas presents for his siblings. Brady and Hindley lured John to Saddleworth Moor, where he was sexually assaulted and murdered. His body was discovered in 1965, during the initial investigation that brought Brady and Hindley to justice. The third victim was a 12-year-old girl named Leslie Ann Downey, who disappeared on December 26, 1964, from a fairground in the Ancoats district of Manchester. Leslie Ann was a small, pretty girl who had gone to the fairground with friends and who became separated from them. Hindley approached Leslie Ann at the fairground and lured her into a vehicle by offering her a ride home, a ruse that was devastatingly effective because it exploited a child's natural trust in a friendly adult woman. Leslie Ann was taken to the house at 16 Wardlebrook Avenue in Hattersley, a housing estate in Greater Manchester where Brady and Hindley were then living. Inside the house, Leslie Ann was forced to undress, gagged, and subjected to horrific sexual abuse that was recorded on audio tape by Brady. The tape, which was discovered by police during the investigation, captured the child's terrified cries, her pleas to be allowed to go home, and the calm, commanding voices of Brady and Hindley as they directed her suffering. After the recording was made, Leslie Ann was strangled to death, and her body was buried in a shallow grave on Saddleworth Moor. The existence of this audio recording, which was played in full during the trial, was one of the most harrowing pieces of evidence ever presented in a British courtroom and ensured that the names Brady and Hindley would be permanently associated with the very depths of human depravity. The fourth victim was a 17-year-old boy named Edward Evans, who disappeared on October 6, 1965, from the Hattersley estate where Brady and Hindley lived. Edward was a physically strong young man, unlike the younger and more vulnerable children who had been the previous victims, and his murder marked a departure from the established pattern that may have reflected Brady's growing confidence and his desire to escalate. Brady lured Edward to the house on Wardlebrook Avenue by asking him to help move some heavy items, a request that Edward, who was known as a helpful and obliging young man, agreed to. Once inside the house, Brady attacked Edward with a hatchet, striking him repeatedly in the head and killing him. The murder of Edward Evans was witnessed by David Smith, the 17-year-old husband of Myra Hindley's younger sister, Maureen, who had been invited to the house by Brady and Hindley under the pretense of helping with some work. Smith watched in horror as Brady killed Evans, and he was then forced to help Brady and Hindley clean the blood from the scene and wrap the body in a sheet for disposal. Brady told Smith that they were going to bury Evans on the moors, but Smith, terrified for his own safety, feigned compliance and then fled the house as soon as he was able. After a sleepless night during he debated whether to go to the police, fearing that Brady and Hindley would kill him and his wife if he did, Smith finally went to the Hyde police station on October 7, 1965, and reported what he had seen. His testimony was the catalyst that brought the investigation to life. When police arrived at 16 Wardlebrook Avenue, they found the body of Edward Evans wrapped in a sheet in a spare bedroom. Brady and Hindley were arrested, and a search of the house began. During the search, investigators discovered a number of critical pieces of evidence, including a suitcase in the attic that contained photographs taken on Saddleworth Moor, some of which showed the graves of victims, and the audio recording of the torture of Leslie Ann Downey. The photographs were particularly significant because they provided a visual record that could be used to locate the burial sites on the moor, and they also showed Myra Hindley on the moors in poses that suggested her active participation in the burials. A notebook found in the house contained a list of names, including those of some of the victims, written in Brady's handwriting. Brady and Hindley were charged with the murders of Edward Evans and Leslie Ann Downey, and as the investigation continued, the evidence linking them to the other victims on the moors accumulated. The police search of Saddleworth Moor, guided by the photographs found in the suitcase, located the body of John Kilbride in October 1965. The bodies of Pauline Reed and a fifth victim, a 10-year-old girl named Keith Bennett who had disappeared on June 16, 1964, were not found at this time. The trial of Ian Brady and Myra Hindley began at Chester Assizes on April 19, 1966, and it was a proceeding that gripped the entire nation. The prosecution, led by Attorney General Sir Elwyn Jones, presented a case that was devastating in its forensic detail and its emotional power. The audio recording of Leslie and Downey's torture was played in court, and the effect on the jury, the judge, and the assembled observers was profound. Several members of the jury were visibly distressed, and the judge, Mr. Justice Atkinson, was reported to have been shaken by the experience. The photographs from the suitcase were introduced as evidence, showing the moors, the burial sites, and Myra Hindley standing beside the graves. Brady and Hindley were tried together, but their defenses were markedly different. Brady, who conducted his own defense with a degree of legal skill that surprised observers, maintained a posture of contemptuous silence for much of the trial, declining to offer any explanation or express any remorse for the crimes. Hindley, on the advice of her legal team, adopted a different strategy, claiming that she had been a passive participant who had been coerced by Brady into assisting with the crimes and that she had not known what Brady intended to do when he lured the children to their deaths. This defense was directly contradicted by the audio recording, on which Hindley's voice could clearly be heard directing Leslie and Downey's suffering, and by the photographs showing her on the moors near the burial sites. On May 6, 1966, the jury returned verdicts of guilty against both defendants on all charges. Ian Brady was convicted of the murders of John Kilbride, Leslie and Downey, and Edward Evans. Myra Hindley was convicted of the same 3 murders and also of being an accessory after the fact in the murder of Pauline Reed. Both were sentenced to life imprisonment. Mr. Justice Atkinson, in passing sentence, described the crimes as wholly evil and stated that Brady and Hindley were beyond the reach of any human sympathy. The case of the Moors murderers, as Brady and Hindley became known, provoked an outpouring of public revulsion and anger that was unprecedented in post-war Britain. The targeting of children, the sexual torture recorded on audio tape, and the burial of the victims on a bleak and beautiful landscape that was familiar to millions of people from postcards and hiking trips created a sense of violation that went beyond the normal horror associated with even the most serious crimes. Myra Hindley became a figure of particular public hatred, largely because her gender made her crimes seem more transgressive and more threatening to the social order. The image of a woman who could lure children to their deaths and participate in their torture contradicted every assumption that British society held about maternal instinct and feminine nature, and Hindley was demonized in the press and in the public imagination to a degree that few criminals in British history have matched. Ian Brady, while equally culpable, was in some ways absorbed into the category of the monstrous male criminal, a type that British culture had a framework for understanding, however inadequately. Hindley's gender made her a more disturbing and more hateable figure, and the campaign to keep her in prison until she died became a cause that united politicians, the press, and the public across the political spectrum. Hindley made multiple attempts to obtain parole over the years, and each attempt was met with fierce public opposition that resulted in her application being denied. She claimed to have found religion in prison and expressed remorse for her crimes, though the sincerity of her remorse was widely questioned. Ian Brady, who was diagnosed with a personality disorder but not with mental illness in the legal sense, consistently refused to express any remorse or to participate in any rehabilitation programs. He spent much of his incarceration in high-security psychiatric hospitals, including Ashworth Hospital on Merseyside, where he was held under the Mental Health Act. Brady went on hunger strikes on multiple occasions, demanding to be transferred to a regular prison and to be allowed to die, and he was force-fed by medical staff during these protests. In 2015, Brady wrote a book entitled The Gates of Janus, in which he analyzed the psychology of serial killers and continued to express his contempt for conventional morality. Ian Brady died on May 15, 2017, at Ashworth Hospital, at the age of 79. His death was reported with a notable lack of public sympathy, and there was a widespread feeling that his death was an event that should have occurred decades earlier. Myra Hindley had died on November 15, 2002, at the age of 60, while still incarcerated. The body of Keith Bennett, the 10-year-old boy who disappeared in 1964, has never been found, despite extensive searches of Saddleworth Moor over the decades. Brady claimed to have provided information about the location of Keith's grave to various intermediaries, but the information was never sufficiently precise or reliable to lead to the recovery of the body. Keith's mother, Winnie Johnson, who died in 2012, spent the rest of her life campaigning for the recovery of her son's body, and her decades-long vigil became one of the most poignant and heartbreaking elements of the Moors murder story. The case of Ian Brady and Myra Hindley had a transformative effect on British society and its understanding of evil. It shattered the post-war assumption that the kind of industrial-scale atrocities associated with Nazi Germany could not happen in Britain, and it forced a recognition that the capacity for extreme evil exists within ordinary communities and ordinary-seeming individuals. The case changed the way British police investigated child abductions and murders, leading to the development of more sophisticated systems for tracking missing children and sharing information between jurisdictions. It also contributed to a broader cultural shift in which the innocence of childhood came to be seen as something that required active protection rather than something that could be taken for granted. For the families of Pauline Reed, John Kilbride, Leslie and Downey, Edward Evans, and Keith Bennett, the case was an unending nightmare that defined the rest of their lives, and the images of Saddleworth Moor, once a place of natural beauty and recreation, became permanently associated in the British consciousness with the darkest chapter in the nation's criminal history. Number 8, Gwendolyn Graham and Kathy Wood, two women who met while working as nursing assistants at the Alpine Manor nursing home in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and who embarked on a chilling murder spree that claimed the lives of 5 elderly and defenseless residents under their care. A case that exposed the terrifying vulnerability of the elderly in institutional settings and the unique and disturbing phenomenon of female-on-female killer partnerships. Gwendolyn Graham was born on August 6, 1963, in Lansing, Michigan, and grew up in a working-class household that was marked by the kind of chronic instability and dysfunction that can produce deeply damaged adults without necessarily producing obvious warning signs. Graham was a large, physically imposing woman who stood approximately 6 feet tall and weighed well over 200 pounds, a physical presence that gave her a natural advantage in situations involving physical coercion and that may have contributed to the dynamics of her relationship with her eventual accomplice. Graham's early life was characterized by a series of disrupted relationships, academic failures, and behavioral problems that set her apart from her peers. She had difficulty maintaining employment and struggled to form healthy interpersonal relationships, a pattern that was consistent with the emerging picture of a woman who lacked the psychological resources to navigate adult life successfully. Graham had been married at least once before the events that would make her infamous, and that marriage, like most of her relationships, had ended badly, leaving her emotionally raw and desperate for the kind of intense, exclusive bond that she had never been able to find. Kathy Wood was born in 1962, and her background was in many ways a mirror image of Graham's, filled with the same kind of emotional deprivation and psychological damage that had shaped Graham's development. Wood was a small, wiry woman who stood barely 5 feet tall, a stark physical contrast to Graham that made their eventual partnership a study in the way complementary vulnerabilities can fuse into something far more dangerous than the sum of its parts. Wood had also been through a failed marriage and had children from that relationship, and she was struggling to support herself and her family on the low wages available to someone with her limited education and employment history. Wood was described by those who knew her as a talkative, manipulative, and attention-seeking woman who craved drama and excitement in her life and who had a talent for reading people and exploiting their weaknesses. When Gwendolyn Graham and Kathy Wood met at the Alpine Manor nursing home in Grand Rapids in the mid-1980s, they were both working as nursing assistants, a job that required minimal formal training and that placed them in direct, unsupervised contact with some of the most vulnerable people in society. The Alpine Manor was a for-profit long-term care facility that catered primarily to elderly residents who required round-the-clock supervision and assistance with the basic activities of daily living, including bathing, dressing, feeding, and toileting. The residents of Alpine Manor were, by definition, people who could not protect themselves, who depended entirely on the staff for their survival and well-being, and who were in no position to resist or report abuse by the people entrusted with their care. The working conditions at Alpine Manor, like those at many for-profit nursing homes of the era, were characterized by chronic understaffing, high employee turnover, inadequate supervision, and a management culture that prioritized cost containment over patient safety. These conditions created an environment in which abuse could occur with relative impunity, as there were simply not enough staff members to provide adequate oversight and as management was often reluctant to investigate complaints that could lead to liability or regulatory sanctions. It was within this context of institutional failure that Graham and Wood began their relationship. What began as a workplace friendship quickly evolved into a romantic and sexual relationship, a development that was not uncommon in the close, emotionally intense environment of a nursing home but that took on a deeply sinister character in the hands of these two particular women. Graham and Wood became inseparable, spending their breaks together, working the same shifts, and developing an intense private world that excluded their colleagues and supervisors. Their relationship was characterized by a power dynamic in which Graham, the larger and more physically imposing of the two, was the dominant partner, while Wood, the smaller and more psychologically manipulative of the pair, was the submissive partner who derived her sense of identity and purpose from her connection to Graham. This dynamic, which was the inverse of what might be expected based on their physical sizes alone, was a reflection of the complex and often counterintuitive psychological mechanics of criminal partnerships, in which the person who appears to be the weaker party can in fact be the more dangerous one in terms of the ability to plan, manipulate, and direct criminal behavior. According to Wood's later testimony, which formed the basis of the prosecution's case against Graham, the idea of killing one of the nursing home residents emerged from a conversation in which Graham expressed a desire to know what it felt like to kill someone. Wood, who was desperate to maintain Graham's love and who feared that Graham would lose interest in her and move on to someone else if she did not comply with her demands, agreed to help. They reportedly developed a plan to murder residents in a way that would not attract attention, selecting victims who were already in poor health, who had few visitors, and whose deaths would be unlikely to prompt investigation or suspicion. They even reportedly created a list of potential victims, assigning them letters of the alphabet in a grim parody of a game, with the goal of killing one resident for each letter of the alphabet. This alleged alphabetical scheme, which was described in detail during her testimony, was never independently verified, but it became one of the most cited and most chilling details of the case, capturing as it did the apparent casualness and playfulness with which Graham and Wood approached the taking of human life. The first known victim was a 78-year-old woman named Ada May, whose full name was Ada May Ingersoll, who died at Alpine Manor on January 1, 1986. Ada May was a frail, elderly woman with advanced dementia who required total care and who had no regular visitors to monitor her condition or advocate on her behalf. According to Wood's account, Graham entered Ada May's room late at night, when the facility was quiet and staffing was at its lowest level, and suffocated the elderly woman by holding a washcloth over her nose and mouth until she stopped breathing. Wood claimed to have been present during the killing, acting as a lookout, and to have watched as Graham murdered the woman who had been placed in her care. The death of Ada May was attributed to natural causes and was not investigated, as was the case with most deaths of elderly nursing home residents at the time, a reflection of the systemic failure to recognize and respond to signs of foul play in institutional settings. The second victim was an 80-year-old woman named Mary Rose, whose full name was Mary Rose White, who died at Alpine Manor on February 1, 1986. Approximately 1 month after Ada May's death. Mary Rose was another frail and vulnerable resident who had few visitors and whose death was unlikely to attract attention. Wood testified that Graham again suffocated the victim, this time using a plastic bag or washcloth, while Wood stood watch. The third victim was an 81-year-old woman named Elva, whose full name was Elva Stender, who died on March 9, 1986. The fourth victim was a 62-year-old woman named May, whose full name was May Mason, who died on April 20, 1986. The fifth and final known victim was an 83-year-old woman named Dorothy, whose full name was Dorothy Duperry, who died on May 15, 1986. In each case, the method of killing was the same, suffocation, and in each case, the death was attributed to natural causes without any investigation or autopsy. The victims were all women, all elderly, and all profoundly vulnerable, selected specifically because their deaths would not generate the kind of scrutiny that might expose the killings. The murder spree at Alpine Manor came to an end not because of any investigative breakthrough by law enforcement or any intervention by the nursing home's management but because of the collapse of the relationship between Graham and Wood. As is common in criminal partnerships, the intense psychological bond that had held the two women together began to fray under the weight of guilt, fear, and the inherent instability of a relationship built on a foundation of shared criminality. Graham and Wood broke up in 1986, and Wood left Alpine Manor and moved to Texas with her children. It was after the breakup that Wood first disclosed the murders to people around her, telling a friend and eventually telling her ex-husband about the killings at Alpine Manor. The information eventually reached law enforcement in Michigan, and an investigation was opened. The investigation into the Alpine Manor murders presented significant challenges for prosecutors. All 5 victims had been buried, and their bodies had been attributed to natural causes at the time of death, which meant that there was no forensic evidence of foul play available from the bodies themselves. No autopsies had been performed on any of the victims, a failure that meant the physical evidence of suffocation that might have been detectable immediately after death had long since degraded beyond the point of detection. The nursing home's records were reviewed, but they contained no obvious signs of tampering or irregularity that would independently corroborate Wood's account. The entire case against Graham rested on the testimony of Kathy Wood, who was not only an accomplice to the murders but who had a personal motive to lie about Graham's role, given that they had broken up acrimoniously and that Wood was facing the possibility of criminal charges herself. Prosecutors recognized the weakness of a case that relied entirely on the uncorroborated testimony of an accomplice, and they made the strategic decision to offer Kathy Wood a plea bargain in exchange for her testimony against Gwendolyn Graham. Under the terms of the agreement, Wood pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and conspiracy to commit second-degree murder and received a sentence of 20 to 40 years in prison. In exchange, she agreed to testify against Graham at trial, providing a detailed account of the planning and execution of all 5 murders. Gwendolyn Graham's trial began in 1989 in Kent County Circuit Court, and it was a proceeding that hinged entirely on the credibility of Kathy Wood's testimony. Graham's defense attorney mounted a vigorous attack on Wood's credibility, pointing out the lack of physical evidence, the absence of autopsies, the plea agreement that gave Wood a powerful incentive to lie, and the acrimonious nature of the women's breakup. The defense argued that Wood had fabricated the story of the murders to punish Graham for ending their relationship and to avoid a more severe sentence for herself. The prosecution countered that Wood's testimony was corroborated by circumstantial evidence, including the statistical improbability of 5 otherwise healthy residents dying of natural causes within a 5-month period in the same facility, and by the details of Wood's account, which were consistent and specific in ways that suggested they were based on actual events rather than fabrication. The jury found the prosecution's case persuasive, and on November 30, 1989, Gwendolyn Graham was convicted of 5 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. The judge sentenced her to 5 consecutive terms of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, ensuring that she would spend the rest of her natural life in prison. Graham was subsequently transferred to the Huron Valley Correctional Facility in Ypsilanti, Michigan, the state's only prison for women, where she remains incarcerated to this day. Kathy Wood served her sentence in the Michigan Department of Corrections system and was granted parole in 2020, after serving approximately 34 years of her sentence. Her release was met with mixed reactions, with some advocates for the elderly and for victims' rights arguing that her participation in the murder of 5 vulnerable nursing home residents warranted a longer period of incarceration, while others pointed to her cooperation with prosecutors and the fact that she had served a substantial portion of her sentence as factors supporting her release. The case of Gwendolyn Graham and Kathy Wood had a profound impact on the nursing home industry and on the regulatory framework governing the care of elderly residents in institutional settings. In the years following the convictions, Michigan and several other states enacted legislation requiring more thorough investigations of deaths in nursing homes, including mandatory autopsy requirements for deaths that occur under suspicious or unexplained circumstances. The case also prompted the federal government, through the Health Care Financing Administration, which administered the Medicare and Medicaid programs, to strengthen the regulations governing nursing home staffing, supervision, and reporting requirements. The case forced a national conversation about the vulnerability of elderly people in institutional care, a conversation that was long overdue and that led to significant improvements in the way nursing homes are monitored and regulated, though advocates for the elderly continue to argue that more needs to be done to protect residents from abuse and neglect. The case also attracted significant attention from criminal psychologists and criminologists who were fascinated by the all-female nature of the partnership and by the motivations that drove two women to murder elderly people in their care. Research into female criminality has consistently shown that women who commit murder are far less likely than men to use violence as a primary method and are far more likely to target people they know, particularly family members, rather than strangers. The Graham and Wood case was unusual in that it involved two women who murdered people who were not family members but who were nevertheless in a relationship of dependency and trust, and it was even more unusual in that the murders were apparently motivated not by financial gain or personal grievance but by a desire for excitement, bonding, and the experience of killing itself. Some experts have suggested that the Graham and Wood partnership represents a form of folie à deux, a shared delusional disorder in which two individuals reinforce each other's pathological beliefs and behaviors until the combined result is far more dangerous than either person would have been alone. Others have argued that the case is better understood as an example of coercive control within a same-sex relationship, with Graham using her physical and psychological dominance to compel Wood's participation in the murders. Still others have pointed out that Wood's role was not merely passive, as she was the one who allegedly suggested the alphabetical scheme and who acted as a lookout during the killings, suggesting a higher degree of agency and culpability than the coerced victim narrative would imply. The debate over the precise psychological dynamics of the Graham and Wood partnership has never been definitively resolved, and the case remains one of the most studied and debated examples of female criminal partnership in the criminological literature. For the families of Ada Mae Ingersoll, Mary Rose White, Elva Stender, Mae Mason, and Dorothy Duperrey, the case was a source of incomprehensible pain and guilt, as they were forced to confront the fact that their loved ones had not died peacefully of natural causes as they had been told but had been murdered by the people who had been entrusted with their care. The betrayal of trust at the heart of the case, the violation of the most basic obligation of a caregiver to do no harm, was a wound that cut deeper than the murders themselves, and it was a wound that the families carried with them for the rest of their lives. The Alpine Manor nursing home eventually closed, and the building was demolished, erasing the physical location where 5 elderly women had their lives stolen by 2 people who were supposed to protect them. The case of Gwendolyn Graham and Kathy Wood stands as a permanent reminder of the vulnerability of the elderly and of the terrible consequences that can result when institutions fail to fulfill their most fundamental obligation to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Number 9, James Gregory Marlowe and Cynthia Lynn Kaufman, a pair whose violent and chaotic multi-state rampage across the American West in 1986 resulted in the kidnapping, sexual assault, and murder of at least 4 women, a case that exposed the deadly consequences of a criminal partnership built on shared addiction, sexual sadism, and a complete absence of moral restraint that allowed them to drift through communities like a predatory storm, leaving destruction and death in their wake. James Gregory Marlowe was born on February 27, 1953, in Joplin, Missouri, a small city in the southwestern corner of the state that sits near the borders of Kansas, Oklahoma, and Arkansas in the heart of the Ozarks region. Marlowe's early life was a study in the kind of generational dysfunction and neglect that produces damaged individuals with alarming regularity in communities where poverty, substance abuse, and inadequate social support systems intersect. His parents were chronically unable to provide a stable home environment, and Marlowe spent much of his childhood in the care of various relatives and in foster placements that offered physical shelter but little in the way of emotional nourishment or consistent discipline. As a boy, Marlowe exhibited behavioral problems that were serious enough to attract the attention of child welfare authorities, though the interventions available at the time were insufficient to address the depth of his psychological disturbance. He was aggressive, defiant, and prone to acts of cruelty that suggested a fundamental lack of empathy, a deficit that would only widen as he grew older. Marlowe's adolescence was marked by escalating criminal behavior, including theft, vandalism, and assault, and he had his first contact with the juvenile justice system at a young age. By the time he reached adulthood, Marlowe had accumulated a criminal record that was striking both for its length and for the variety of offenses it encompassed. He was convicted of multiple felonies, including robbery, burglary, and sexual assault, and he served several prison sentences in the Missouri correctional system. Prison did not rehabilitate Marlowe; if anything, it hardened him and expanded his criminal repertoire, exposing him to more sophisticated criminal thinking and to a network of offenders who shared his predilection for violence. Marlowe developed a severe methamphetamine addiction that fueled his criminal behavior and exacerbated his already volatile temperament, producing a man who was capable of extraordinary violence when provoked or when the impulse struck him, and who was entirely unconcerned with the consequences of his actions for himself or for others. He was described by those who encountered him in the criminal justice system as a manipulative, charming, and dangerous individual who could present a convincing facade of normalcy when it suited his purposes but who could switch to terrifying aggression in an instant. Cynthia Lynn Kaufman was born on January 15, 1958, in St. Louis, Missouri, and her path to becoming James Marlowe's accomplice in murder was shaped by a lifetime of psychological instability, substance abuse, and a pattern of relationships with abusive and dominant men that systematically eroded whatever capacity for independent judgment and moral reasoning she may have possessed. Kaufman grew up in a working-class area of St. Louis, and her childhood was marked by family dysfunction, including parental alcoholism and emotional neglect. She was a troubled adolescent who struggled academically and socially, dropping out of high school and becoming sexually active at a young age, a pattern that reflected her desperate need for male attention and validation. Kaufman married for the first time as a teenager, a union that produced children but that was characterized by the same patterns of instability and conflict that had defined her upbringing. She developed a serious substance abuse problem in her late teens and early 20s, using a variety of drugs and alcohol to self-medicate the emotional pain and emptiness that had been her constant companion since childhood. Her addiction led to a series of increasingly desperate circumstances, including periods of homelessness, involvement in sex work, and multiple arrests for drug-related offenses and petty crime. Kaufman's relationships with men followed a consistent and self-destructive pattern in which she attached herself to dominant, controlling, and often violent partners who exploited her vulnerabilities and deepened her psychological damage. By the time she reached her mid-20s, Kaufman was a deeply damaged woman with a fractured sense of self, a severe drug addiction, and a psychological profile that made her exquisitely susceptible to the influence of a predator like James Marlowe. The exact circumstances under which James Marlowe and Cynthia Kaufman met are somewhat murky, but it is established that they encountered each other in the early 1980s, most likely in the Missouri correctional system or in the criminal underworld that surrounded it. Marlowe was incarcerated at various times in Missouri prisons, and Kaufman had her own involvement with the criminal justice system, and it is possible that their paths crossed during a period of incarceration or shortly after one or both of them had been released. What is clear is that by the time they began their killing spree in the fall of 1986, Marlowe and Kaufman had formed a bond that was based on a shared commitment to criminality, substance abuse, and sexual violence, and that Marlowe was the dominant partner in the relationship, controlling Kaufman through a combination of physical abuse, psychological manipulation, and the provision of drugs that kept her dependent and compliant. The spree began in October 1986, shortly after Marlowe and Kaufman had left Missouri and traveled west, drifting through Colorado, California, and Arizona in a stolen vehicle with no particular destination and no plan other than to satisfy their impulses for drugs, sex, and violence. Their first known victim was a 20-year-old woman named Lynell Murray, who was working at a dry cleaning business in Costa Mesa, California, when she was abducted by Marlowe and Kaufman on October 11, 1986. Murray was a bright, friendly young woman who was well liked by her co-workers and who had no connection to her attackers. Marlowe and Kaufman forced Murray into their vehicle at gunpoint, drove her to a motel room in nearby Newport Beach, and held her captive for a period of hours during which she was sexually assaulted by Marlowe while Kaufman participated and watched. At some point during the captivity, Marlowe strangled Lynell Murray to death, using a ligature, and then he and Kaufman fled the scene, leaving her body in the motel room. The discovery of Murray's body sparked a homicide investigation by the Costa Mesa Police Department, but at this point, there was nothing to connect the murder to Marlowe and Kaufman, who had already moved on. Less than 2 weeks later, on October 23, 1986, Marlowe and Kaufman struck again in a manner that was even more brazen and terrifying. They entered a shopping mall in Big Bear Lake, a mountain community in San Bernardino County, California, and abducted a 31-year-old woman named Karina Novus from the parking lot. Novus was a secretary who had stopped at the mall on her way home from work, and she was forced into Marlowe and Kaufman's vehicle at gunpoint in broad daylight, an act of extraordinary audacity that suggested either supreme confidence in their ability to avoid capture or a complete indifference to the consequences of being caught. Novus was driven to a location in the desert where she was sexually assaulted and murdered, though her body was not discovered until November of that year, when it was found in a remote area near Barstow, California. The delay in finding Novus's body complicated the investigation, as the decomposition of the remains made it more difficult to establish the precise cause and manner of death, though forensic evidence eventually linked the case to Marlowe and Kaufman. The third victim was a 19-year-old woman named Catherine May, who was abducted from a convenience store in Flagstaff, Arizona, on November 7, 1986. May was a college student who was working part-time at the store to support her studies, and she was taken by Marlowe and Kaufman in a scenario that followed the now-established pattern of armed abduction, sexual assault, and murder. May's body was found in a desert area near Flagstaff, and the investigation was handled by the Flagstaff Police Department and the Coconino County Sheriff's Office. The fourth known victim was a young woman named Cheryl Jean Fowler, who was abducted in Henderson, Nevada, in November 1986. Fowler was a 20-year-old woman who had been living a transient lifestyle and who was particularly vulnerable to predation because of her limited social connections and her lack of a stable residence. Her body was discovered in the desert near Las Vegas, and the investigation was conducted by the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. The investigation that ultimately brought Marlowe and Kaufman to justice was the result of a convergence of evidence from multiple jurisdictions, a process that was significantly hampered by the fact that the crimes were spread across 4 states and involved different law enforcement agencies with different procedures, different levels of resources, and different degrees of experience with complex multi-jurisdictional investigations. The critical break in the case came from the abduction of Karina Novus in Big Bear Lake, where witnesses at the shopping mall had provided descriptions of the suspects and their vehicle, descriptions that were sufficiently detailed to generate composite sketches that were distributed to law enforcement agencies throughout the region. Additionally, Marlowe and Kaufman had made a series of mistakes that left a trail of evidence connecting them to the crimes, including the use of credit cards and personal checks stolen from their victims, the use of motel rooms that required registration information, and the theft of vehicles that could be traced through their vehicle identification numbers. The investigation was further aided by the fact that Marlowe and Kaufman were, despite the brutality of their crimes, fundamentally disorganized and impulsive offenders who lacked the discipline and foresight to cover their tracks systematically. They were eventually tracked to a motel in the Las Vegas area, where they were arrested on November 14, 1986, by officers from the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department and the FBI. At the time of their arrest, both Marlowe and Kaufman were in possession of items that had been stolen from their victims, and they were driving a vehicle that had been reported stolen in connection with one of the abductions. The arrest of James Marlowe and Cynthia Kaufman was the beginning of a complex and protracted legal process that spanned multiple states and required extensive coordination between prosecutors in California, Arizona, and Nevada. The decision was made to try Marlowe and Kaufman first in California, where the evidence in the Costa Mesa and Big Bear Lake cases was the strongest, and to pursue charges in the other jurisdictions afterward. The trial of James Marlowe and Cynthia Kaufman in San Bernardino County, California, began in 1989, several years after their arrest, a delay that was caused by the complexity of the multi-jurisdictional case and by the extensive pretrial motions and appellate issues that arose during the intervening period. The prosecution presented a case that was built on physical evidence, including forensic evidence linking Marlowe and Kaufman to the crime scenes and to the victims, witness testimony from individuals who had seen the couple in the areas where the abductions occurred, and the testimony of Cynthia Kaufman herself, who had agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for a promise that she would not face the death penalty. Kaufman's testimony was devastating to Marlowe's defense, as she provided a detailed account of the planning and execution of the murders, including her own role in luring victims, participating in the sexual assaults, and helping Marlowe dispose of the bodies. She described Marlowe as the dominant force in the relationship who had controlled her through abuse and manipulation and who had forced her to participate in the crimes under threat of death. The defense attacked Kaufman's credibility, pointing out the plea agreement that gave her a powerful incentive to minimize her own role and maximize Marlowe's, and arguing that Kaufman was an equal participant who had been motivated by her own sadistic impulses rather than by coercion. The jury rejected the defense's arguments. On May 31, 1989, James Marlowe was found guilty of the first-degree murder of Karina Novus and was sentenced to death. He was subsequently tried and convicted for the murder of Lionel Murray in Orange County and received a second death sentence. Cynthia Kaufman was also convicted of the first-degree murder of Karina Novus and, despite the plea agreement with prosecutors, was sentenced to death by the jury, which found that the aggravating circumstances of the crime outweighed any mitigating factors. The sentencing of Kaufman to death, over the objections of the prosecution, which had recommended a life sentence in exchange for her cooperation, was a rare and controversial outcome that reflected the jury's assessment of the severity of her culpability. The case was appealed through the California appellate courts over the following years, with both Marlowe and Kaufman raising numerous challenges to their convictions and sentences, including claims of ineffective assistance of counsel, prosecutorial misconduct, and errors in the jury instructions. The appeals were largely unsuccessful, and both Marlowe and Kaufman remained on death row at the Central California Women's Facility in the case of Kaufman and at San Quentin State Prison in the case of Marlowe. James Gregory Marlowe died on death row on November 21, 2019, at the age of 66. The cause of death was reported as natural causes, though the specific medical condition was not disclosed. His death came more than 30 years after his arrest and more than 3 decades after he was sentenced to die for the murders of Karina Novus and Lionel Murray. He never expressed remorse for his crimes and never acknowledged the suffering he had caused to the families of his victims. Cynthia Lynn Kaufman remains on death row at the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla, California, where she has been incarcerated since her conviction. Her appeals have been exhausted at the state level, and her case remains in the federal appellate process. Over the years, Kaufman has given a series of interviews from prison in which she has continued to portray herself as a victim of Marlowe's coercion, though she has acknowledged a degree of culpability that was absent from her earliest accounts. The case of James Marlowe and Cynthia Kaufman forced a difficult examination of the criminal justice system's handling of multi-jurisdictional serial crime and of the complex question of female culpability in partnership homicides. The fact that Kaufman was an active participant in the abduction, sexual assault, and murder of multiple women, and that she received a death sentence from a jury that was not bound by the prosecution's plea recommendation, challenged the prevailing assumption in some quarters that women who participate in violent crimes with male partners are invariably coerced or less culpable. The case demonstrated that women are capable of participating in the most extreme forms of criminal violence and that the criminal justice system must evaluate each case on its individual facts rather than relying on gender-based assumptions about culpability and coercion. For the families of Lionel Murray, Karina Novus, Catherine May, and Cheryl Jean Fowler, the case was a source of enduring pain and frustration, as the legal process dragged on for decades without delivering the finality of executed sentences. The knowledge that Marlowe died of natural causes on death row rather than by the hand of the state was a bitter pill for the families, who had waited more than 30 years for a closure that never fully came. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of young women in public spaces, a vulnerability that was compounded by the fact that Marlowe and Kaufman were able to abduct their victims in broad daylight in busy areas without attracting immediate attention. A reality that prompted law enforcement agencies to increase public awareness campaigns about personal safety and to improve the training of officers in the recognition and investigation of abduction patterns. The legacy of James Marlowe and Cynthia Kaufman is a reminder that evil does not require sophistication or intelligence to be devastating, and that the combination of addiction, sexual sadism, and moral emptiness can produce a lethal threat that is as unpredictable as it is deadly. Number 10, Lawrence Sigmund Bittaker and Roy Lewis Norris, a pair whose systematic abduction, torture, sexual assault, and murder of 5 teenage girls in Southern California over a period of approximately 5 months in 1979 produced what experienced homicide investigators have consistently described as the most horrific and disturbing case in the history of Los Angeles County, a case that established a new baseline for human depravity and that forever changed the way law enforcement in California and across the nation approached the investigation of serial sexual homicide. Lawrence Bittaker was born on September 27, 1947, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and his early life presented none of the obvious markers of childhood trauma or severe dysfunction that are sometimes, though not reliably, associated with the development of a serial killer. Bittaker was placed in an orphanage shortly after his birth, not because of any known defect or crisis in his biological family but because his parents, who were unmarried at the time, made the decision to place him for adoption. He was subsequently adopted by a couple named George and Mary Bittaker, who gave him a stable, middle-class upbringing in the Los Angeles area after the family relocated to California when Lawrence was a young child. George Bittaker was a professional man who provided adequately for his family, and by all outward accounts, Lawrence's childhood was unremarkable, free of the physical abuse, sexual exploitation, and severe neglect that feature prominently in the backgrounds of many violent offenders. This absence of identifiable developmental trauma made Bittaker's later crimes all the more perplexing and disturbing to the psychologists and criminologists who studied him, as it suggested that his capacity for extreme violence was not the product of environmental damage but of something far more intrinsic and irreparable. As a child and adolescent, Bittaker displayed antisocial tendencies that were troubling but not necessarily predictive of the horrors to come. He was intelligent, with an estimated IQ that placed him in the above-average range, and he possessed a verbal fluency and a superficial charm that allowed him to navigate social situations effectively when he chose to do so. Beneath this polished exterior, however, Bittaker was a deeply alienated and emotionally vacant individual who formed no genuine attachments to other people and who viewed human relationships entirely through the lens of instrumental utility. He began engaging in criminal behavior as a teenager, starting with petty theft and vandalism and escalating to more serious offenses, including armed robbery, as a young adult. His criminal record prior to 1979 included multiple convictions for burglary, robbery, and assault, and he had served time in both juvenile and adult correctional facilities in California. It was during one of his periods of incarceration that Bittaker met the man who would become his accomplice in atrocity. Roy Lewis Norris was born on February 5, 1950, in Greeley, Colorado, and his background stood in stark contrast to Bittaker's in almost every measurable respect. Norris grew up in a profoundly dysfunctional and abusive household that provided a textbook example of the kind of environmental damage that can contribute to the development of violent criminality. His parents were alcoholics who subjected Roy and his siblings to regular physical beatings and emotional abuse, and the family home was a chaotic and frightening place where violence was a daily occurrence. Norris was a poor student who struggled academically and socially, and he was identified at an early age as a boy with serious behavioral problems that included aggression toward peers and animals, fire setting, and a disturbing sexual preoccupation that manifested in inappropriate behavior toward girls at his school. He dropped out of high school without graduating and drifted into a life of petty crime and substance abuse that led to his first incarceration as a teenager. Norris's criminal record, which predated his association with Bittaker, included a conviction for a sexual offense, a fact that is significant because it established that Norris's capacity for sexual violence existed independently of his relationship with Bittaker and predated the killing spree by several years. Norris had been convicted of assaulting a young woman and had served a prison sentence in Colorado before moving to California, where he eventually found his way into the California correctional system and into the cell block where Lawrence Bittaker was serving time. The meeting of Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris in the California prison system in the mid-1970s was a catastrophic collision of two damaged and dangerous personalities, each possessing qualities that amplified the destructive potential of the other. Bittaker, the more intelligent and socially skilled of the two, was the dominant partner in the relationship, providing the strategic planning, the organizational discipline, and the cold, calculating rationale that transformed random violent impulses into a systematic killing operation. Norris, the more impulsive and sexually driven of the pair, provided the aggressive energy and the sexual sadism that fueled the commission of the crimes. Together, they formed a partnership that was far more lethal than either man would have been alone, a phenomenon that has been observed repeatedly in the study of criminal duos and that reflects the synergistic nature of predatory partnerships. During their incarceration together, Bittaker and Norris spent countless hours discussing their fantasies of sexual violence and murder, fantasies that became increasingly detailed and specific as they reinforced each other's desires. They reportedly made a pact that once they were released from prison, they would purchase a vehicle that could serve as a mobile torture chamber and would hunt for victims together, a pact that both men would fulfill with horrifying fidelity after their releases. Bittaker was paroled from prison in 1978, and Norris was paroled shortly afterward, and within a matter of months, they had obtained a vehicle, a 1977 GMC van that Bittaker purchased and modified for their purposes, and had begun the systematic hunt for victims that they had planned during their incarceration. The van was critical to their operation, as it provided a mobile, private space in which they could abduct, torture, and kill their victims without the risk of being interrupted or discovered. Bittaker outfitted the van with a bed, curtains on the windows, and a variety of tools and implements that could be used to restrain and torture victims, including pliers, wire, a sledgehammer, and an ice pick. He also installed a tape recorder and a microphone, which he used to record the screams and pleas of the victims during the torture sessions, recordings that he and Norris played back for their own amusement after the killings were completed. The killing spree of Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris began on June 24, 1979, when they abducted two teenage girls, 16-year-old Lucinda Schaefer and 13-year-old Mary Elizabeth, whose last name has been withheld in some accounts to protect her family's privacy, from a beach in the Redondo Beach area of Los Angeles County. The girls were forced into the van at knife point and driven to a remote area in the San Gabriel Mountains, where they were subjected to prolonged sessions of sexual torture that involved the use of pliers, a sledgehammer, and other implements. Both girls were murdered, and their bodies were dumped in separate locations in the mountains. The disappearance of the two girls prompted a massive search by law enforcement, but their bodies were not discovered until months later, a delay that allowed Bittaker and Norris to continue their spree without interference. The second set of victims was abducted on July 31, 1979, when Bittaker and Norris kidnapped an 18-year-old woman named Jacqueline Leah Lamp from a street in Torrance, California. Jacqueline was a young woman who was walking to a friend's house when the van pulled up beside her and she was forced inside at gunpoint. She was driven to the same remote mountain area where the first two victims had been taken, where she was sexually assaulted, tortured with pliers and a sledgehammer, and murdered. Her body was discovered in a ravine in the San Gabriel Mountains in November 1979. The third victim was a 15-year-old girl named Shirley Lynette Ledford, who was abducted on October 31, 1979, Halloween night, as she was walking home from a school event in the Sunland area of Los Angeles. Shirley was forced into the van and driven to a residential area where Bittaker and Norris parked the van for an extended period and subjected the girl to a prolonged and agonizing torture session that was captured in its entirety on the audio tape that Bittaker had set up. The tape, which was later recovered by investigators and played during the trial, contained approximately 20 minutes of recording that documented Shirley's screams, her pleas for mercy, her appeals to Bittaker and Norris by name, and the calm, conversational voices of the two men as they tortured her with pliers, a sledgehammer, and a car cigarette lighter, laughing and joking as she begged for her life. After the torture session, Shirley was murdered, and her body was left on a residential lawn in the Sunland area, a departure from the previous pattern of dumping bodies in remote mountain locations. The body of a fifth victim, a 16-year-old girl whose identity was established through investigation but whose name has been withheld in some accounts, was also linked to Bittaker and Norris through forensic evidence and circumstantial investigation, though the precise circumstances of her abduction and murder were less fully documented than those of the other victims. The investigation that brought Bittaker and Norris to justice was one of the most intensive and emotionally grueling in the history of the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department and the Los Angeles Police Department, agencies that jointly investigated the case. The discovery of the victims' bodies over a period of several months in late 1979 and early 1980 gradually established a pattern that pointed to a single pair of offenders operating in the Los Angeles area. The critical break in the case came from an unexpected source. Roy Norris, who had a history of impulsivity and poor judgment that stood in sharp contrast to Bittaker's calculated discipline, bragged about the murders to an acquaintance named Jimmy Dalton, a man he had met through the criminal underworld. Dalton was sufficiently disturbed by what Norris told him that he went to the police and provided a detailed account of Norris's confession, including information about the van, the tools used in the torture, and the audio recordings that Bittaker had made. This information gave investigators the probable cause they needed to obtain search warrants for Bittaker's residence and the van, and the resulting searches produced a treasure trove of physical evidence, including the audio tape of Shirley Ledford's torture, photographs taken by Bittaker and Norris of their victims, the tools used in the torture sessions, and other items that linked the two men conclusively to the murders. Lawrence Bittaker was arrested on November 20, 1979, and Roy Norris was arrested shortly afterward. Both men were charged with 5 counts of first-degree murder, 5 counts of kidnapping, 5 counts of robbery, and multiple counts of sexual assault and torture. The trial of Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris was separated, with Norris being tried first. Norris, recognizing the overwhelming evidence against him and facing the very real possibility of the death penalty, agreed to plead guilty to all charges in exchange for a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. His plea agreement included a requirement that he testify against Bittaker at trial, a commitment that he fulfilled, providing the jury with a detailed account of the planning and execution of the murders that corroborated the physical evidence and provided the narrative context that the prosecution needed to secure a conviction. Bittaker's trial began in January 1981 in Los Angeles County Superior Court, and it was a proceeding that tested the emotional endurance of everyone in the courtroom. The prosecution, led by Deputy District Attorney Stephen Kay, who would become one of California's most prominent death penalty prosecutors, presented a case that was built on a foundation of forensic evidence that was as comprehensive as it was horrifying. The audio tape of Shirley Ledford's torture was the centerpiece of the prosecution's case, and its playback in court was an experience that left jurors, attorneys, the judge, and court personnel visibly shaken. Several jurors required counseling after the trial, and Judge William Keene, who presided over the case, later described it as the most disturbing case he had encountered in his years on the bench. The defense attempted to challenge the admissibility of the audio tape and to undermine Norris's credibility as a witness, arguing that Norris was a convicted felon who had agreed to testify against Bittaker in exchange for his own life. The jury was unconvinced by the defense's arguments. On February 17, 1981, Lawrence Bittaker was found guilty on all counts and was sentenced to death. The judge imposed the death penalty, describing Bittaker's crimes as acts of such extreme depravity and cruelty that they warranted the most severe punishment available under California law. Roy Norris was sentenced to 45 years to life in prison, with the understanding that he would never be paroled. Lawrence Sigmund Bittaker spent the next 38 years of his life on death row at San Quentin State Prison, becoming one of the longest-serving death row inmates in California history. During his decades of incarceration, Bittaker exhausted multiple layers of state and federal appeals, all of which were denied. He never expressed remorse for his crimes and never acknowledged the humanity of his victims, maintaining to the end a posture of cold indifference that was entirely consistent with the psychological profile of a man who was fundamentally incapable of empathy or moral reasoning. Bittaker died on December 13, 2019, at the age of 72, while still on death row. The cause of death was reported as natural causes. His death, like that of many California death row inmates who die of old age before the state carries out their sentences, was a source of frustration and anger for the families of the victims, who had waited 40 years for a closure that the state was unable or unwilling to provide. Roy Lewis Norris died on February 24, 2019, at the age of 68, while incarcerated at the California Medical Facility in Vacaville. He, too, died of natural causes. The case of Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris had a profound and lasting impact on the criminal justice system in California and across the United States. The sheer scale and horror of their crimes, combined with the methodical and premeditated nature of their killing operation, forced law enforcement agencies to re-evaluate their approaches to the investigation of serial sexual homicide and to develop new investigative techniques and protocols for tracking and apprehending serial offenders. The case was one of the primary drivers behind the creation of the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program by the FBI, as it demonstrated with devastating clarity the need for a national system that could identify patterns of serial crime across jurisdictions and share information in real time. The case also had a significant impact on the way prosecutors and courts handle the presentation of extremely graphic evidence, particularly audio and video recordings, in criminal trials, leading to the development of guidelines and procedures designed to balance the probative value of such evidence against the risk of traumatizing jurors and other trial participants. For the families of the 5 teenage girls whose lives were stolen by Bittaker and Norris, the case was an unending nightmare that defined the rest of their lives. The loss of a child is the most devastating experience a parent can endure, and the loss of a child to the kind of systematic torture and sexual violence that Bittaker and Norris inflicted is a horror that defies description and that leaves scars that never fully heal. The families became advocates for victims' rights and for improvements in the criminal justice system, channeling their grief into a determination to ensure that what happened to their daughters would never happen to another family. The case of the Toolbox Killers, as Bittaker and Norris became known, a name derived from the tools they used to torture their victims, remains the gold standard for horror in the annals of American true crime, a case that serves as a permanent reminder that the capacity for evil exists within the human species to a degree that exceeds the bounds of imagination and that the most important weapon against that evil is a criminal justice system that is vigilant, thorough, and relentless in its pursuit of justice for the victims.